The night she caught her fiancé kissing her own cousin, Lyra Whitlock made a decision that would change everything. She ran. Not home. Not to safety. She ran straight into the arms of the most dangerous man in the kingdom. In the shadows of the Mooncrest Ball, she collided with a hooded stranger and begged him to dance with her. He said yes. And the moment his hand closed around hers, something ancient inside him went completely still for the first time in years. That man was King Calor of Virethorn, the cursed Alpha that an entire kingdom feared. She didn't know who he was. He couldn't forget who she was. And what happened next would shake the foundations of every frontier territory from the highlands to the border walls. Stay until the end. Hit like. And drop the name of the city you're watching from. Because this story is for every person who was counted out before they even began. The night of the Mooncrest Ball was supposed to be the most beautiful night of Lyra Whitlock's life. She had spent 3 weeks preparing for it. 3 weeks of fittings and alterations, of standing motionless while seamstresses pinned silver fabric to her waist and murmured approvals about the drape of the neckline, the way the hem caught the candlelight. 3 weeks of practicing her smile in the mirror, not the real one, the tight, controlled one she wore whenever she was in the presence of her fiancé's family. The smile that said, "I belong here. I am grateful. I will not cause trouble." She had believed that smile. She had almost convinced herself it was real. The Whitlock family was not wealthy. They were not titled. What they had was a long and carefully maintained reputation for respectability, a reputation that had taken generations to build and could be demolished in a single season if Lyra made the wrong move. Her mother reminded her of this every morning over breakfast. Her aunt reminded her every time they met at church. And her fiancé, Dorian Ashvale, reminded her in the way he sometimes looked at her, not with love exactly, but with the calm satisfaction of a man inspecting a piece of property he had agreed to purchase at a fair price. She had told herself it was enough. She had been wrong. Upset. The Mooncrest Ball was held every year in the grand estate of the Ashvale family, whose ancestral home sat on the northern edge of the city like a stone crown. 300 guests moved through its gilded rooms that night. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across silk gowns and tailored coats. The orchestra played in the eastern ballroom, sweeping romantic pieces that floated through the corridors and up the staircases and made everything feel, for a few hours, like a world in which ordinary sorrows did not exist. Lyra had arrived on Dorian's arm, smiling the correct smile. She had greeted his parents with the correct degree of deference. She had laughed at the correct moments during the toasts. She had danced one waltz with Dorian, feeling his hand flat and formal against her back, and she had told herself that this was what a stable future felt like. Solid, predictable, safe. Then she had gone to find the powder room on the second floor. She had taken the wrong corridor. That was all. A simple mistake, a wrong turn, the kind of small accident that should mean nothing. But the door at the end of that corridor was slightly ajar, and the room beyond was lit by a single candle. And when Lyra pushed the door open with 2 fingers, she saw Dorian standing with his hands cupped around the face of her cousin, Sarah, kissing her with a tenderness he had never once shown Lyra in 2 years of engagement. For a long moment, Lyra simply stood there. She registered the details the way the mind registers things in moments of shock, disconnected, clinical, as though the information were being processed by a part of her that had not yet received the message that it mattered. Sarah's champagne glass on the windowsill, Dorian's jacket folded neatly over the back of a chair, the candle flame wavering in the draft from the open door. Then Dorian looked up and saw her. "Lyra!" She closed the door. She walked back down the corridor with her hands clasped in front of her, her heels clicking against the marble in a rhythm that felt much too controlled for what was happening inside her chest. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She descended the main staircase and moved through the crowded ballroom with the fixed, purposeful expression of a woman who knew exactly where she was going, when in fact she had no idea at all. She just needed to move. She needed to keep moving before the thing cracking open inside her reached her face and everyone in the room could see it. "Lyra!" Dorian's voice from somewhere behind her, closer than she expected. He had followed her. Of course he had followed her. Not because he was sorry, she understood that now with absolute clarity, but because a public scene would be inconvenient for him. She moved faster. through the archway at the far end of the ballroom, through the antechamber beyond it, where a few guests stood in quiet conversation, through the second set of doors, which opened onto the night garden, a wide torchlit terrace that sloped down toward a hedge maze, beyond which the music from the ballroom was distant and soft and cruel in its beauty. The night air hit her face, and she breathed it in, and the crack in her chest widened slightly. "Lyra, stop! Let me explain!" She spun around. Dorian stood in the doorway behind her, his expression composed in the particular way of men who believed they could manage any situation with enough calm authority. His jacket was back on, his hair was tidy. He looked, she thought with sudden vicious clarity, like a man who had never done anything wrong in his life, because he had always arranged his world carefully enough that nothing he did was ever required to be called wrong. "Don't," she said. "It's complicated. Sarah and I have a history that predates. I said don't." Her voice was very quiet. That frightened him, she could tell. More than tears would have, more than shouting. He took a small step forward, lowering his voice to the register of a man offering reason to an unreasonable woman. "You're upset, that's understandable. But if you cause a scene here in front of my family's guests..." "You were kissing my cousin. I told you, it's complicated. There are arrangements between our families that you don't fully understand that your mother and my father discussed before our engagement. Arrangements." The word came out of her like something she was spitting out. "You're telling me this was an arrangement." "I'm telling you," he said, his tone sharpening slightly, the veneer of patience wearing thin, "that you were brought into this engagement because your family needed the connection, and my family agreed to the terms. That doesn't mean that everything else in my life simply ceases to exist. You knew the kind of life you were entering." She stared at him. She had known, she realized, not the specifics, not Sarah, but the shape of it, the way she had always been placed and positioned and managed rather than chosen. She had known, and she had smiled her correct smile and told herself it was enough to be secure, to be provided for, to be spared the uncertainty of a life without safety. She had been wrong about that too. "I won't cause a scene," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice was. "But I'm also not going back in there. Lyra?" She turned and walked down the terrace steps into the torch-lit garden, and this time she did not look back. The hedge maze at the bottom of the garden was not meant to be entered during the ball. There were no torches inside it, no paths lit for guests who wandered. But Lyra walked into it anyway, because it was dark and it was away from everything, and she needed, desperately, a few minutes where no one could see her face. She let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. She knew, in the practical part of her brain that never fully switched off, that she couldn't afford more than that. Her eyes would swell, her composure would be lost, and there were 300 people on the other side of that hedge who would read her face the moment she returned to the light. So she gave herself 2 minutes, standing in the dark between the tall hedges with her hands pressed flat against her sternum, and she cried silently and completely. And then she stopped. She wiped her face with the backs of her wrists, breathed, squared her shoulders. She was 23 years old. She had no money of her own, no property, and now apparently no fiancé, because she would not, under any circumstances, continue an engagement to a man who considered her a family arrangement. She would figure the rest of it out. She was not going to fall apart in a hedge maze at the Mooncrest Ball. She began walking toward the far exit of the maze, the one that led around the side of the estate rather than back through the garden. She would collect her wrap from the cloakroom, and she would leave, and she would deal with her mother's reaction in the morning. She turned a corner. She walked directly into someone. The collision was solid. She hit a wall of a chest, stumbled back, and would have fallen if a pair of hands hadn't caught her arms with a speed that seemed almost impossible, steadying her before she even registered she was off balance. She looked up. The man was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall and broad-shouldered in a way that felt less like physical size and more like presence, the kind that filled a space and altered the atmosphere of it, the way a storm on the horizon changes the quality of the air before it arrives. He wore a deep charcoal riding coat, the collar turned up, and a low hood that cast his face in shadow. She could see the line of a jaw, strong and clean, the set of a mouth, unsmiling, eyes that caught the faint reflected torchlight from somewhere beyond the hedge. Gray-green, she thought, though in this light she couldn't be certain. "I'm so sorry," she said automatically. "You're not hurt." It wasn't a question. His voice was low, even, with the particular economy of a man unused to wasting words. "No, I—" She caught herself, steadied her breathing. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He released her arms. He said nothing. He seemed, she noticed, with some part of her mind that was still functioning clearly despite everything, entirely unbothered by the collision. Not annoyed, not flustered, not reaching for the social pleasantries that most people defaulted to in awkward moments. He simply stood there, watching her with the steady patience of something that had existed for a long time and had no particular need to hurry. Then she heard Dorian's voice from somewhere back in the maze. Not close, but getting closer. "Lyra, Lyra, this is foolish. Come back inside and we'll discuss this properly." She felt the panic rise before she could stop it. Not fear of Dorian exactly, but the fear of that conversation, the one where he would be calm and reasonable and make her feel irrational for being hurt, the one where he would arrange the narrative so neatly that she'd doubt her own eyes, the one where 300 people would watch his composed version of events, and she'd have no ground to stand on. She looked at the stranger. She made a decision in about 2 seconds flat. "I know this is an extraordinary thing to ask of someone I've just collided with in a hedge maze," she said, lowering her voice. "But would you be willing to dance with me? Inside, just for a few minutes. There's a man in this maze who would like to corner me into a very unpleasant conversation, and if I walk back into the ballroom with someone, it will at least delay that conversation until I've figured out how to handle it." The man looked at her for a moment. Not the quick, calculating look of someone weighing social risk, but something quieter than that, as though he were reading something in her face that she hadn't said aloud. "Yes," he said. They walked back through the maze and up the terrace steps, and through the antechamber doors, and into the ballroom, and the stranger offered her his arm with a naturalness that suggested he was at least familiar with formal social settings, and Lyra took it, and she focused very hard on breathing normally. The orchestra was playing something in 3/4 time, lush and melodic. Other couples moved across the floor in the easy, practiced way of people who had been dancing together at balls like this for years. Lyra had been trained in formal dance. Her mother had seen to that, had seen to every item on the checklist of accomplishments a respectable young woman was expected to possess. So when the stranger turned to face her and raised his hand to the appropriate position, she followed without thinking, and they stepped onto the floor, and his hand closed around hers. She didn't know how to describe what happened next. It wasn't dramatic, or not in the way she would have expected drama to feel. It was quieter than that, like something shifting slightly, the way a note resonates in the body when it's played at exactly the right pitch. His hand was warm through her glove. He held her at the correct formal distance. His movement was controlled, precise. Not the showy, performative grace of men who dance to be noticed, but the quiet competence of someone for whom the mechanics of motion were simply not a problem. She should have been thinking about Dorian, about her mother, about what she was going to do next. But for the first time in the entire terrible evening, those thoughts were simply still. She was aware of the music and the movement and the warmth of his hand, and the gray-green eyes watching her from beneath the shadow of the hood with an expression she couldn't read. "You play," he said. Not a question again. She had a feeling he didn't ask many questions. She glanced up at him. "What makes you say that?" "The way you hear the music. Most people dance to it. You move inside it." She blinked. It was in its way the most accurate description anyone had ever given of how she related to music, and she'd been playing piano since she was 4 years old. "I do play," she said. "Piano, since I was a child." He nodded. Something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. Something that looked oddly like recognition, as though she had confirmed something he'd already suspected. They danced in silence for a moment. She found she didn't mind the silence. It wasn't the awkward kind that needed to be filled, but the comfortable kind that existed between people who didn't require performance from each other. She couldn't remember the last time she'd been in a room with someone and not felt the low-grade pressure of performing correctly. "Whoever he is," the stranger said, without inflection, "he didn't deserve whatever he did." She looked up at him. You don't know what he did? No. But you walked into that maze 10 minutes ago and you walked out of it like someone who just decided to stop caring about something very important to them. That kind of decision doesn't happen over something small. She stared at him. You watched me go into the maze? I was already there. What were you doing in a hedge maze at a ball? The ghost of something, not quite a smile but the architecture of one, appeared at the corner of his mouth. Avoiding people. Despite everything, despite the wreckage of her evening and the rawness still sitting behind her sternum, she felt something that was almost a laugh form in her throat. She suppressed it. We have that in common, then. It seems we do. The music shifted, the orchestra moving from one piece to the next without pause. And they continued moving, and Lyra was aware with some removed observational part of her mind that this was the longest she had gone without thinking about Dorian since she'd walked out of that room, and that it was the first time in months she had danced without tracking her own performance. Then someone on the far side of the ballroom said his name. Not loudly, just a murmur, the kind that ripples through a room when something significant enters it. A widening of eyes, a shift of posture, a quiet cascade of whispers spreading from one cluster of guests to the next. Lyra caught it first as a change in the atmosphere of the room. Then she caught the words, "The king didn't announce Virethorn." She went very still. The King of Virethorn was not a figure who appeared at social events in the lowland cities. He was not, by all accounts, a figure who appeared in public at all if he could avoid it. The frontier kingdom of Virethorn was a hard land, high plateaus and deep forests and ancient fortress walls, and its ruler was said to be harder still. King Kalor, the cursed Alpha. The man the broadsheets described in carefully indirect language that stopped just short of calling him dangerous. Severe, reclusive, ruled by instinct rather than reason. There were older stories, rougher ones, that circulated in taverns and markets. Stories about his father and his father's father, and the bloodline madness that claimed the Virethorn Alphas one by one as they aged. Stories about what he became when the curse took hold. Lyra looked up at the man she was dancing with. The hood, the deliberate anonymity, the way he'd been standing alone in the dark at the far end of a hedge maze, the eyes that caught light like something feral and patient and very old. Of course. "Oh," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He was watching her face as she processed it. His expression hadn't changed, still that same unreadable steadiness. But something in it had sharpened slightly, and she understood that he'd been waiting for the moment she figured it out. "Your Majesty," she said, the words coming out with an automatism that bypassed her entirely stunned mind. "Don't." The word was quiet, immediate. "Not here. Not tonight. I just danced with the King of Virethorn because I was hiding from my fiancé in a hedge maze." "Former fiancé," he said, "based on the look on your face when you came out of that maze." She stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated that she couldn't entirely categorize. The collision of too many different things at once. The wreckage of her evening, the absurdity of this moment, the lingering warmth of his hand in hers, the very specific way he was looking at her as though she were something he hadn't expected to find and couldn't quite decide what to do with. Then, from across the room, "Lyra." Dorian's voice again, closer this time, cutting through the music with the flat authority of a man who genuinely believed she would come when he called. She stepped back from the king. The warmth of his hand disappeared. "Thank you," she said, meaning it in more ways than she could articulate. "For the dance, for—" She stopped. She didn't have words for the rest of it. For the stillness, for the 5 minutes of just existing inside the music without performing anything. Something moved in his eyes that she couldn't name. "Lyra Whitlock," he said, not asking, just saying it, the way someone names something they intend to remember. She turned and walked quickly toward the edge of the ballroom, toward the cloakroom, toward out. She did not see him again that night. She collected her wrap. She slipped out through the side entrance while Dorian was still searching the main floor. She walked 20 minutes to her family's townhouse in the cold dark, her silver hem dragging against the cobblestones, and she let herself in through the back, and she sat at the kitchen table in her ball gown and her ruined evening, and she sat with the knowledge that everything she had built her near future around had just quietly disintegrated. She should have been devastated. She was devastated, in a way. There was real grief there for the safety she'd believed in, for the version of her life she'd been constructing with those 3 weeks of careful smiling. But underneath the grief was something that surprised her, something that felt, despite everything, almost like relief. The engagement was over, the arrangement was finished. She had nothing now except the problem of figuring out what came next. She thought about the man in the hedge maze, the way the music had gone still inside her when his hand took hers, the way he'd said former fiancé with perfect calm, as though the correction were simply obvious and required no explanation, the way he'd watched her face when she'd realized who he was, not with the expectation of being impressed or intimidated, but with something more careful than that, more private. She told herself it didn't matter. He was the King of Virethorn. She was Lyra Whitlock, untitled, undoweried, with a cracked engagement and a mother who was going to be furious in the morning. Whatever that dance had been, it was finished. She went upstairs to bed. She was wrong, of course, about it being finished, but she didn't know that yet. The morning after the Mooncrest Ball, Lyra Whitlock had precisely 2 problems. By midday, she had 3. The first was her mother, who had heard the news about Dorian through the family's social network before Lyra had finished her first cup of tea, and who had arrived at Lyra's bedroom door with an expression of barely contained catastrophe and a series of increasingly frantic questions about what exactly Lyra had said to Dorian and whether there was any possibility of repairing things before it became official. "There isn't," Lyra said from the bed, where she was sitting with her knees drawn up and her second cup of tea. "Lyra, he was kissing Sarah in an upstairs room during the ball. I saw them." Her mother was silent for a moment. "Well," she said, and the single word contained multitudes, shock, and something that might have been relief briefly fighting with practicality before practicality won. "Well, that is genuinely difficult." "Yes. Does Sarah know you saw?" "I have no idea. Because if this becomes public knowledge before we've had a chance to, Mother," Lyra set down her cup. "I'm not going to manage the narrative of him kissing my cousin. He was kissing my cousin. The engagement is over." Her mother sat down on the edge of the bed with the careful manner of a woman absorbing a significant blow. "Then we'll need to think very carefully about your prospects. You're 23, Lyra. The Whitlock name still carries weight. But if it gets out that the Ashvale family broke off the engagement, they didn't break it off, I did. Which is worse from a social perspective. A woman who— Mother." Her voice came out with a firmness that surprised them both. "I know. I understand the implications. I will figure it out. But I'm not going back to Dorian, and I'm not managing a story to protect him, and I would very much appreciate one day before we start solving it." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Then, to Lyra's faint astonishment, she reached out and patted her hand once, briefly, and nodded. "One day," she said, and left. That was the first problem. The second problem was money. Or rather, the sudden sharpening of the money problem that had always been quietly present but had been dulled by the expectation of the engagement. The Whitlock family had enough to live on, but only carefully. The kind of careful that required constant maintenance and left no margin for disruption. The engagement to Dorian had represented, among other things, the removal of that pressure. Without it, Lyra needed income. She spent the morning making a list of her practical skills in the small notebook she kept for practical matters. Piano. She had been trained to a high standard, higher perhaps than anyone in her social circle fully appreciated, because she'd had the kind of natural aptitude that responds to training the way certain materials respond to heat, taking a shape that doesn't go away. She'd been giving informal lessons to the younger daughters of neighbors for the past 2 years, mostly as a social courtesy, but she could formalize that. She could take on more students. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be hers. She wrote piano lessons, expanded the top of the list, and underlined it. Then the third problem arrived. It came in the form of a letter, delivered by a courier in a gray and silver livery she didn't recognize. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored paper with a seal pressed in dark wax. A wolf's head, clean and severe, beneath a crown. She opened it at the kitchen table. Alone, her tea gone cold. Miss Lyra Whitlock, you are formally invited to present yourself at Virethorn Keep on the 14th day of this month for the purpose of an interview for the position of music tutor to Her Royal Highness, Princess Aveline of Virethorn. The position is salaried, residential, and commences immediately upon acceptance. Travel arrangements have been made at the Crown's expense. Please send your reply by return courier. By order of His Majesty King Caelor of Virethorn. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, because she had not, in the entire practical inventory she'd made of her situation that morning, accounted for the possibility that the King of Virethorn would send a letter to her door 14 hours after their dance. She thought about his eyes in the hedge maze, the way he'd said her name, Lyra Whitlock, with that careful, deliberate weight, as though committing it to memory with intention. She thought about the salary, residential, which meant she would be in the castle, which was simultaneously the most logical and the most absurd solution to her current circumstances that she could possibly imagine. She thought about the wolf's head on the seal and the stories about the cursed Alpha, and the way the currency of fear ran through his name every time it appeared in conversation. She picked up her pen. Your Majesty, I will be there on the 14th. Lyra Whitlock. She told her mother that evening. The conversation was, predictably, complicated. Virethorn, her mother said. Yes. The king's household. His sister needs a piano tutor. I'm a piano tutor. Lyra, the stories about that man are stories. She said it with more certainty than she necessarily felt. I need income. This is income. It's a salaried position with a room, and it puts distance between me and the situation with Dorian, which I believe is something we both want. Her mother looked at the letter again, at the wolf's head seal, at the formal precision of the language. She was quiet for a long moment. Are you frightened? She finally asked. Lyra thought about it honestly. She thought about the dance, about the stillness, about the way he'd steadied her in the maze before she'd even registered she was falling. No, she said. I don't think so. It was the truest thing she'd said all day. She left on the morning of the 14th in a carriage bearing the Virethorn insignia, gray with silver detail, drawn by 4 dark horses with the quiet power of animals bred for difficult terrain. The driver was a man of few words, which Lyra appreciated. She watched the city dissolve behind her through the carriage window and felt, with a clarity that should have frightened her and somehow didn't, that she was moving towards something rather than simply away from something. The road north was long and changed character as it climbed. The green lowland fields giving way gradually to higher, starker country, the forest growing denser and older, the sky wider and cleaner in a way that made the city air she'd lived in her whole life seem, in retrospect, considerably more constrained. By the time the towers of Virethorn Keep came into view, gray stone against gray sky, fortress walls that looked like they had grown out of the mountain rather than been built upon it, the sun was going down. She watched them through the glass and felt her heart do something complex. She was here because of a dance, because of a broken engagement, and 2 minutes crying in a hedge maze, and the warm weight of a hand that had steadied her before she knew she was falling. She straightened her spine. She was here for the salary, and for the princess's piano lessons, and for the chance to build something of her own with her own hands. Everything else she would figure out as she went. The carriage rolled through the keep's outer gates, and the stone walls closed around her, and somewhere above her in that fortress of shadow and cold air, a king was listening to the sound of the wheels on the courtyard stones with an attention that was far more focused than it had any reason to be. He had told himself it was simply practical. The princess needed a tutor. Miss Whitlock was qualified. He had told himself that 12 times in the past 3 days, and he had not quite managed to believe it once. But the thing inside him, the thing that had been tearing at his control for years, the ancient fury in his blood that his father had warned him about, and that had claimed his grandfather entirely, The thing he had been fighting alone and in silence since the day he understood what it was. That thing had been quiet since the night of the ball. For 3 days, it had been quiet. He did not know what that meant. He was afraid, in the way of a man who has stopped hoping for things, to investigate it. But she was here now. He stood at the window of his study and listened to the sound of the carriage and did not move, and the wolf inside him, for the 4th day in a row, sat still. The carriage rolled to a full stop in the inner courtyard, and the silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Lyra had grown up in a city where silence was rare and usually meant something was wrong. Here, in the stone throat of Virethorn Keep, silence seemed to be the default state. Not empty, but dense, layered, the kind of quiet that accumulates over centuries and becomes something close to presence. She stepped down from the carriage onto cobblestones worn smooth by generations of boots, and she looked up at the keep's main tower rising black against the last of the evening light, and she breathed in air that smelled of pine and cold stone and something faintly animal she couldn't name. A woman was waiting for her at the base of the entrance steps, tall, angular, with iron-gray hair pulled back so severely it seemed to function as a structural element, and an expression that communicated, with remarkable efficiency, that she had been managing this fortress for 30 years and had seen every kind of newcomer and had been impressed by precisely none of them. Miss Whitlock. The woman's voice matched her posture, correct, controlled, with no warmth wasted. I am Maret. I serve as the keep's head of household. His Majesty is occupied this evening. I'll show you to your rooms and explain your duties. Thank you, Lyra said. Maret looked at her for one additional second, the evaluating kind, head to toe, and then turned and went up the steps without further ceremony. Lyra followed her. The interior of the keep was warmer than the exterior suggested, though not by a large margin. Stone corridors were lit by iron wall sconces, the light amber and slightly unsteady in the drafts that moved through the castle like their own kind of weather. The walls were hung in places with tapestries, old ones, the colors faded to a palette of rust and sage and dark gray, and the imagery in them, on the brief glances Lyra got as she walked, was consistently wolves. Wolves running, wolves standing on ridgelines, wolves surrounding a crowned figure in what might have been a coronation or a hunt, the distinction blurring somewhere in the ancient embroidery. The princess's rooms are on the 3rd floor of the east wing, Maret said, without looking back. Your rooms are adjacent. Lessons will take place in the music room on the 2nd floor, which has the best instrument in the keep. It was brought from the capital 12 years ago at considerable expense and has been played approximately 4 times since. The princess is not, I will be direct with you, a motivated student. How old is she? 16. She's also sharp, impatient, and not accustomed to being told she's wrong about anything. A brief pause. She is also, underneath all of that, somewhat lonely. I mention it because the tutors who've lasted longest here have understood that the second thing is more relevant than the first. Lyra absorbed this. How many tutors has she had? Music tutors specifically? You're the 4th. What happened to the other 3? Another pause, slightly longer. The first resigned after 2 weeks, citing personal reasons. The second lasted a month before the weather sent her back south. The third, Maret stopped at a doorway and turned to face Lyra for the first time since they'd entered the building. Her expression hadn't changed, but something in it had shifted slightly, in the way of a person deciding how much of a truth to offer. The third left after an incident in the castle that unsettled her. She didn't specify the nature of it, and I didn't ask. Lyra met her eyes. The king, she said. Maret held her gaze for one beat. I advise all staff to remain in the east wing after the 9th evening bell. The king keeps his own hours, and his portion of the castle is his own. Those who respect that boundary find employment here to be, if not comfortable, at least manageable. And those who don't? Find employment elsewhere, Maret said, and opened the door. None. Lyra's rooms were better than she'd expected. A bedroom and a small adjoining sitting room, both with windows that looked out over the mountain forest to the north, the trees so dense below that they formed something close to a solid surface, dark and vast, stretching to a horizon she couldn't see in the failing light. There was a fire already laid in the hearth. Someone had placed a small vase of dried mountain flowers on the writing desk, the only softness in an otherwise spare, functional space. She set her traveling bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the castle breathe. Somewhere in the east wing corridor outside, a door opened and closed. Footsteps. Light, quick, with the specific rhythm of someone who walked fast, not because they were in a hurry, but because stillness didn't suit them. They stopped outside her door. Then, without a knock, the door opened. The girl who appeared in the doorway was not what Lyra had been building in her imagination during Marae's description. She'd been picturing something willful and sharp-edged, all angles and challenge. And those things were there. The intelligence in the dark eyes, the set of the jaw, the clothes that were technically formal but worn with a studied carelessness that said, "I put these on because I was told to, not because I care." But she was also unexpectedly young-looking for 16, and there was something unguarded in her curiosity, a quality that hadn't yet learned to disguise itself as something cooler. "You're smaller than I thought you'd be," the girl said. "Princess Aveline," Lyra said, standing. "Don't do that, the standing. Everyone does that, and it makes conversations take twice as long." Aveline leaned against the doorframe and studied her with the frank attention of someone who hadn't learned that staring was considered rude or had learned it and didn't care. "Marit said you came from the city." "I did." "Why did you come here?" Lyra considered the question and the most honest answer to it. "I needed work," she said, "and the position was offered." Something flickered in Aveline's expression. She'd clearly expected a more polished response, and the plainness of the truth seemed to recalibrate her slightly. "The last music tutor said she came because she was passionate about teaching. She lasted 3 weeks and cried twice that I saw." "I won't promise not to find things difficult," Lyra said, "but I don't think I'll cry about them." Aveline looked at her for another long moment. Then she pushed off the doorframe and turned back down the corridor. "Lessons start at 10 in the morning," she said over her shoulder. "I'm better after breakfast. Also, if you hear sounds from the North Tower after the bells, ignore them. Everyone ignores them." She said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been saying it for years and was very good at making it sound like nothing. "What kind of sounds?" Lyra asked. Aveline stopped walking. Her back was to Lyra, and whatever was in her face when she paused, Lyra couldn't see it. "The kind that are his to deal with," she said, and disappeared around the corner. The first lesson, the following morning, was a study in resistance. Aveline arrived at the music room at 10 past 10, not late enough to be openly defiant, Lyra suspected, but late enough to establish that she was doing this on her own terms. She dropped into the bench beside the piano with the energy of someone performing reluctant compliance, and ran one hand across the keys in a discordant sweep that wasn't quite accidental. The piano itself was extraordinary. Even after 12 years of disuse, it had been maintained. The keys were clean, the action responsive, the tone rich in a way that spoke of genuine quality. Someone had been keeping it in condition even while it went unplayed, and Lyra felt a small particular ache at the thought of an instrument this good, sitting silent in a stone room in a mountain fortress. She sat beside Aveline and played a single chord. Let it ring, waited for it to fully decay before she spoke. "Play me what you know," she said. "Whatever you remember, don't try to perform it, just play." Aveline looked sideways at her. "The last tutor made me do scales for 45 minutes the first lesson." "I'm not her. Play." A beat of uncertainty. Then Aveline turned to the keys and began to play, and Lyra listened with her full attention. Not to technique, or not only to that, but to the person behind the notes. What she heard surprised her. The foundation was there, genuinely, buried under years of inconsistent instruction and the particular kind of stiffness that develops when music is taught as a series of rules to be memorized rather than a language to be spoken. But underneath the stiffness was something real, an ear, a natural sense of phrasing that no amount of bad teaching could have put there. It was either present from birth or it wasn't. "Stop," Lyra said when Aveline reached the end of what she knew. Aveline pulled her hands back. "I know it's not good." "The technique isn't good," Lyra agreed. "Your ear is. We'll work backward from there." Aveline blinked. It was evidently not what any previous tutor had said to her. What does that mean? It means technique is solvable. It means you actually hear music, which is not something I can teach you if you don't already have it. It means Lyra played a brief phrase, the opening of a piece she'd loved since she was a child. Simple, but full of color. That this isn't going to be about scales. It's going to be about what you're actually trying to say. The princess was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the defensive edge in her voice had shifted slightly. Not gone, but different. Nobody's ever taught it that way. I know, Lyra said. Now put your hands back on the keys. By the end of the first lesson, they had the beginning of something that wasn't quite trust, but was at least the precondition for it. A shared language, tentative and functional. Lyra walked back to her room afterward with the particular satisfaction of work that mattered, and it was only when she was back in her sitting room, looking out at the mountain forest, that she realized she had been in the keep for nearly 24 hours and had not seen the king at all. She told herself this was fine. It was in fact exactly as it should be. She was here for the princess. Whatever had happened at the Mooncrest Ball was a separate thing, belonging to a different world, and this was this. She told herself that through dinner, which she ate in the East Wing dining room with Aveline and 2 other household staff, the king's chair at the head of the main dining room table visible through the open connecting door, empty, as it apparently often was, Mare's manner suggesting this was not unusual. She told herself it through the evening, while she sat at her small writing desk and answered a letter from her mother that had arrived that afternoon, full of questions about the castle and careful indirect inquiries about whether Lyra was safe. She told herself it as she prepared for bed, listening to the 9th bell echo through the stone corridors. And then, from somewhere above her, on the north side of the castle, she heard a sound that she could not classify. It was low, barely audible through the stone, but present. A sound that existed somewhere between a growl and a human voice in distress, something that didn't fit the categories she had for sound. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then silence. Then it came again, slightly longer, and in it was a quality she recognized from the few times in her life she'd heard genuine pain. Not theatrical pain, not the kind performed for sympathy, but the stripped-down, involuntary sound of a body being pushed past what it could manage. She sat still at her writing desk for a moment, the kind that are his to deal with. Aveline's voice, careful and practiced. She thought about the stories, the cursed Alpha, the bloodline madness, the way the broadsheets described it in their careful, indirect language. She thought about the way his hand had felt in hers at the ball, the impossible stillness of it. She picked up her candle, walked to her sitting room, sat down at the small upright she'd noticed in the corner. Modest, clearly a secondary instrument kept for practice, and she began to play. She played quietly, not to be heard necessarily, or telling herself not necessarily, just to do something with her hands while the castle made its sounds above her. She played the piece she'd started Aveline on that morning, and then she moved through the pieces she knew best, the ones that lived in her fingers without requiring thought, and the music filled her small room and pushed against the stone walls. The sounds from the North Tower stopped. She didn't notice immediately. She kept playing for another 20 minutes, and when she finally let the last note decay and lifted her hands, she realized the silence above her was complete. No more sounds, just the castle breathing its cold mountain breath and the faint wind against the windows. She sat with her hands in her lap and stared at the middle distance. Then she went to bed. She did not see the king for 6 more days. She heard him once, footsteps in the corridor early in the morning before the household staff were up, the kind of walk that covered ground quickly and without announcement. She stood at her door and listened to them pass and did not open the door because that felt like the right call. She heard evidence of him in other ways. A book left open in the library she'd begun using in the afternoons, a technical treatise on land management in high-altitude territories, a subject she'd never previously considered, left face down on the reading table with a handful of marginal notes and a handwriting that was controlled and angular and carried its intelligence and its precision. She read the notes without meaning to, and then read them again because they were good. Sharp observations that cut directly to the structural problem and proposed solutions that were counterintuitive but logically sound. She heard evidence of him in Aveline, too. On the fourth day, in the middle of a lesson where Aveline was working through a particular passage that required her left hand to operate independently of her right, always the hardest lesson, the one that fought every instinct, the princess made a sound of pure frustration and dropped her hands into her lap. "He listens, you know," she said abruptly. Lyra looked at her. "What?" "Kaelor, when you play in the evenings." Aveline was looking at the piano keys, her expression doing something complicated. "His rooms are above this wing. He can hear through the floor." She paused. "I know because I used to hear him walking when I played, back when I still practiced at night. He'd stop walking while I played and then start again when I stopped." Lyra absorbed this carefully. "The night I arrived," she said, "I played after the 9th bell. He—" "Stopped," Aveline confirmed. "I heard it. The sound stopped." She finally looked up, and what was in her face now was something that cut past all the practiced casualness, something raw and young and carrying a weight it shouldn't have been carrying for as long as it had. "Whatever it is you do when you play, whatever that is, it's the only thing that works. I've tried. I'm not good enough yet, but yours reaches him." The silence between them was different from the ones that usually inhabited lessons. Heavier, more honest. "What's happening to him?" Lyra asked. Because she needed to ask it, because dancing around it felt dishonest in a way she wasn't willing to continue. Aveline was quiet for a long moment. Then she played a single note and let it ring out. "The curse in our bloodline," she said, "takes all alpha males in the Virethorn line. Always has. Our father had it. Our grandfather. It's a violence in the blood. It builds over years, and what it eventually does is take the part of a person that can decide who they are and burn it away. What's left is something that can't control its own nature." She paused. "Kaelor has been fighting it longer than any of them, longer than our father did. But it's getting worse." The note finally died out. "He won't tell me how much worse." Lyra thought about the sounds through the ceiling, about the 3 seconds of something that had existed between a growl and a cry. "And my playing slows it down, maybe, calms whatever it is. I don't know why." Aveline's voice, very carefully flat. "I don't know if it matters. The curse always wins, eventually." She put her hands back on the keys and began the passage again, and Lyra let her because there was nothing useful to say after that. Only the music and the work and the small, insistent hope that useful things came from doing what you could with what you had. She saw him for the first time on the evening of the 7th day, and it was an accident, as the important things tend to be. She'd been awake since before dawn, a habit she'd developed in the city, rising early to have an hour of quiet before the household noise began. In the keep, early morning was its own atmosphere, the fires low, the corridors empty, the stone holding the cold of the night with a fidelity that the daytime never fully dispelled. She'd taken to walking the east wing in those pre-dawn hours with a candle and a cup of tea, getting the feel of the castle in its least performing state. She had gone farther than she meant to. That was the honest accounting of it. The keep's corridors had a way of continuing past the point where she'd intended to turn back. One doorway leading naturally to the next, the architecture creating a momentum that was easy to follow without paying attention. And she'd been thinking about the passage she wanted to work on with Aveline that morning, running it through her mind rather than watching her feet, and she'd pushed open a door that she had simply assumed connected back to the East Wing corridor. It did not connect back to the East Wing corridor. The room beyond it was large and barely lit. A single fire in the hearth at the far end burned down low. Stone floors, high ceilings lost in shadow. It might have been a receiving room or a private study. It was difficult to tell in the low light because most of the furniture was pushed to the walls in a way that left the center of the room empty and open, as though space had been cleared deliberately. And in the center of that open space, on the stone floor, was the king. He was on one knee, head down, one hand braced flat against the floor. He was fully dressed, dark shirt, riding coat, boots, but the clothing was wrong in the way of something worn through rather than worn carefully, hours rather than minutes in it. His other hand was pressed to his chest, fingers curled. His breathing was audible from where Lyra stood in the doorway. Controlled, each breath deliberate and separate, the breathing of someone managing pain through technique rather than relief. He didn't hear her come in, or if he did, he didn't have the capacity at that moment to respond to it. She watched him for 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, she registered the tension in every line of his body, the fine tremor in the braced hand against the floor, the way his jaw was set with a concentration that looked less like anger and more like a man holding a cracking wall together from the inside by force of will alone. She should leave. She knew she should leave. Mart's voice in her head, even and precise. Those who respect that boundary find employment here to be manageable. He had not invited her here. He did not know she was here. He was, more than any person she'd seen in her life, a man in a private extremity, and the correct response to that was to back quietly through the door and pretend she'd never opened it. She crossed the room. She didn't decide to. Her feet made the decision before her mind caught up with it, crossing the stone floor with the same instinct that had moved her hands to the piano keys that first night. Not reason, but something more primary than reason, a body-level understanding that this was what was needed. She stopped a few feet from him. He still hadn't looked up. The tremor in his hand was worse than she'd realized from the doorway. "Your Majesty," she said very quietly. He went absolutely still. The stillness of a person caught in the most private moment of their vulnerability, and the particular terrible quality of that stillness. The way it radiated something that was neither dignity nor its absence but something rawer than either, made her chest tighten. "Leave." His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual control, and she could hear in it what the effort of those 2 syllables cost him. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," she said. "That was not a request, Miss Whitlock." "I know." She took 1 step closer. "But you're shaking, and you're alone, and I don't believe—" She stopped herself, redirected. "Let me help." "There is nothing you can do." Each word came out separately, parceled out like something scarce. She knelt, not beside him, in front of him, just slightly outside his reach, low enough that she was no longer looking down at him. It put her in his line of sight when he finally lifted his head, which he did after a moment. The way a person lifts their head when the thing they've been bracing against pauses long enough to give them space. His face was not what she'd expected. She'd built from the stories, from the broadsheets, an image of something hard and remote. And those elements were present. The severe cut of the jaw, the eyes that were gray-green in full light, and carried in them the particular quality of something that watched rather than performed. But what was in his face now was none of those things. It was bare, in the way of stripped wood, all the surface removed, just the grain of him showing through. And what she saw in that grain was exhaustion, and something that had been fighting for so long it had forgotten the alternative. She reached out her hand, palm up, an offering, not a demand. "You calmed at the ball," she said, "when we danced. I don't know why that is, and I don't know if this will do the same thing, but—" She kept her hand steady, though she was aware of her own heart doing something loud. "Try." He looked at her hand. Something moved in his face, a long, complex negotiation she couldn't fully read. She thought for a moment he was going to tell her to get out again. She thought for a moment he was going to. He reached out and took her hand. The effect was not immediate, not dramatic. It was slow. The way warmth works when you come in from the cold, not a sudden reversal, but a gradual return of something that had been absent. She felt the tremor in his hand through her palm, felt it slowly, over the course of a minute that felt longer than a minute, begin to ease. His breathing changed, still controlled, but the violence going out of the effort, the deliberateness becoming something more like calm and less like crisis management. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. She stayed very still with his hand in hers and looked at the fire dying down in the hearth, and the castle existed around them in its cold, ancient silence. After a long while, he said, "You shouldn't be in this part of the castle." "I know, I went the wrong way." "You should go back." "In a minute." The fire crackled. Outside the high windows, the mountain dark was beginning to thin toward gray. "You played every night," he said. It came out quiet, still stripped of its formal register, and she understood it wasn't an accusation. "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was true, but not the whole truth, and she thought they both knew it. Another silence. His hand had steadied entirely now. He was no longer on one knee. At some point during the last few minutes, without either of them marking the shift, he'd settled back, the braced posture releasing into something less defensive. He was looking at her with an expression she still couldn't fully read, but the exhaustion in it had changed quality. Was less like the exhaustion at the end of a battle and more like the exhaustion that comes after a battle when you've realized, with surprise, that you're still standing. "It's getting worse," he said. "The episodes." She understood he was not a man who said that kind of thing, to anyone. She didn't treat it as an intimacy to be gathered and held, just received it as the fact he was offering it as. "How long?" "Years, but the last few months." He stopped. Something tightened briefly in his jaw. "The council believes I'm still managing it. They need to believe that for now. If the border territories think Virethorn's king is losing control, the wolves smell weakness," she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. Surprised, she thought, that she'd used that language, that she'd followed the logic. "Yes," he said. Outside the windows, the gray was becoming pale gold. The fire had died to coals. His hand was warm and completely steady in hers now, and she was aware with a quiet, clear awareness that this was not a thing she should be doing. Kneeling in the forbidden part of the castle in the pre-dawn dark with the cursed king of Virethorn's hand in hers, the two of them in a silence that had stopped being accidental some time ago and become, instead, something they were both choosing. "I'll go back," she said, "before the household is up." "Yes." He released her hand. "Miss Whitlock." She stood, straightened her skirt, picked up the candle she'd set on the floor when she'd knelt, turned toward the door. "Thank you," he said behind her. Very quiet. The voice of a man for whom those two words cost something real. She didn't turn around. "Sleep," she said, "if you can." She walked back through the door and into the corridor and back to the east wing, following the thread of pre-dawn light through the stone passages, her heart making its complicated noise, and her hand still warm where his had been. Behind her, in the barely lit room, the king stayed on the floor beside the dead fire for a long time. Not because he couldn't move, but because for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, the thing inside him was completely still, and he was not ready to do anything that might disturb it. He had told himself she was here for the lessons. He had told himself that with the same frequency and the same conviction with which he had told himself, at the ball, that the stillness was a coincidence, a quirk of the night, a fluke of the music, something that would not repeat. It had repeated. It repeated every night when she played. And now she had knelt in front of him in the worst moment he'd allowed anyone to see in years, and she hadn't flinched, and she'd held his hand through the worst of it like it was simply the obvious thing to do. He was going to have to be very careful. The problem, he knew, sitting in the dark with the pale gold of early morning beginning to fill the windows, was that careful? Was the one thing he was no longer certain he could be with her. The careful thing lasted 9 days. In those 9 days, Lyra kept to the east wing, and her lessons and her evening hours at the small upright piano, and the king kept to his half of the fortress and his counsels and his silence. And if they thought about each other in the spaces between those things, and they did, she was honest enough with herself to admit that, they did so privately and without evidence. The lessons with Aveline were going well. Well was perhaps understating it. Something had loosened in the princess after the 4th day. The defensive carelessness had begun to peel back layer by layer, revealing underneath it something Lyra had suspected from the first lesson, a genuine hunger for the thing itself, for music as a language rather than a requirement, for the particular freedom that exists in being able to say something true without having to find words for it. Aveline worked harder than she let herself appear to work. She arrived at the music room early some mornings, before Lyra, and played alone. Lyra could hear her from the corridor, the careful repetition of a passage she'd been struggling with, the gradual refinement of it. She never mentioned these extra sessions, and Lyra never brought them up, because some things worked better when they weren't named. On the 5th day after the episode in the North Wing room, Lyra arrived at the music room to find a book on the piano bench. A slim volume, cloth-bound in dark green, worn at the spine. She picked it up. It was a collection of frontier ballads, songs from the mountain territories, the kind that didn't appear in the conservatory repertoire of city musicians. The notation inside was spare and unadorned, The melodies built for voices and simple instruments, the harmonies open and raw in the way of things that had been composed outdoors and close to weather. Someone had marked 3 of the pieces with thin strips of paper. There was no note, no indication of who had left it. She looked at the pieces that had been marked and played through them quietly, and they were, all 3 of them, extraordinary. The kind of music that wore its emotion on its surface without apology, that had been shaped by a world where the distance between people and death was short enough that pretense seemed wasteful. She played them again that evening. She didn't play them quietly. She never heard footsteps above stop. But she knew they did. On the 9th day, the council arrived. Lyra learned about it the way she learned most things about the larger workings of the keep, from Aveline, who had the particular information-gathering capacity of someone who had grown up knowing that knowledge was power and that the adults around her would always underestimate how much she paid attention. "The High Territorial Council," Aveline said during a lesson break, sitting sideways on the piano bench with her legs dangling. "3 of the 7 lords of Virethorn's border territories, plus the Chancellor. They come twice a year. This visit wasn't scheduled." Lyra looked up from the music she was annotating. "What does that mean?" "It means someone called it early, which means someone has concerns they felt needed to be raised in person rather than by correspondence." Aveline's voice was casual. Her eyes were not. "The last time a council was called early, Kaelor was 21, and our father had just died, and the border lords were deciding whether they were going to support his claim or divide the territory between themselves. What happened? He walked into the chamber alone and told them that anyone who didn't support the succession was welcome to say so to his face rather than in corridors, and he'd deal with them individually." A brief, complicated smile. None of them said anything. Lyra considered this. He was 21. He was terrifying at 21. He's worse now. Aveline paused. "The thing is, the council knows about the curse. They've always known. It's in the bloodline. It's documented. They watched it take our father. But as long as Kaelor held the territory and kept the borders and managed the economy of the Highlands, they looked away from it." She stopped playing entirely, folded her hands in her lap. "I think someone told them it's getting worse." The silence in the music room settled differently than it had before. "Who would have done that?" Lyra asked, though a cold certainty was already forming in her chest. "Anyone who thought it was time to start positioning for what comes after," Aveline said, and her voice was 17 years old and exhausted in a way that 17 years old should not have been. "Anyone who wants to be first in line when the king stops being able to hold the throne." She heard the council that afternoon without meaning to. The keep's formal receiving hall was on the first floor of the central wing. Ground floor, high ceilings, the acoustics of a room designed to project authority. Lyra had been returning a borrowed book to the keep's library, which was adjacent to a small interior corridor that ran behind the receiving hall's west wall. She had not known this. She knew it now because she was 3 steps down that corridor when the voices came through the stone, clear enough to follow. The king's voice she recognized immediately. That low, controlled register, the economy of it, every word placed with the precision of someone who understood that how you said something in a room like this mattered as much as what you said. He was managing the council with the same quality she'd noticed that first night in the maze, the patience of something that did not need to perform its authority because its authority was simply present. But the other voices, 4 of them, varying in pitch and bluntness, were not performing deference. "The reports from the Eastern Garrison are consistent, Majesty." A man's voice, older, with the flat cadence of someone accustomed to being the most reasonable person in the room. 3 episodes in the last month that required your withdrawal from command duties. The officers who witnessed them have been discreet, but discretion has a limit. "I'm aware of the reports," Kaelor's voice even. "I authored the protocols that govern how they're handled." "The protocols?" a second voice said, younger, with an edge in it, "were designed for our father's situation. Your situation has accelerated beyond those parameters." A silence. Brief, but with weight in it. "What are you proposing?" the king asked. "A regency structure," the older voice said. "Temporary, formalized through the council charter, which provides for exactly the circumstance. You retain the title and the formal authority, Day-to-day governance transfers to a designated regent until the curse finishes what it started. The king's voice had not changed in volume or register, but something in it had gone very cold. Name it plainly, if you're going to name it. A pause. Until a more permanent solution can be determined. The permanent solution in our bloodline history, Kaelor said, is death. In every recorded case, you know this. No one disputed it. Then what you're proposing, he continued with a precision that cut, is that I hand governance of Virethorn to a regent of your selection, remain in this castle in a condition of managed decline, and be available as a ceremonial figurehead until the curse renders me unmanageable, at which point the question of succession becomes a pause, easier to resolve. That is not what It is exactly what you're proposing. I prefer the direct version. A shift in his voice, still controlled, but with something underneath it now, something that was not entirely human in its resonance. I will not accept a regency. If any member of this council wishes to formally challenge my fitness to govern, they have that right under the charter, and I invite them to exercise it here and now rather than through corridors and early meetings. Silence. Lyra stood in the narrow corridor with her back pressed to the cold stone and the library book clutched against her chest, and her heart doing something that wasn't fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular high alertness of a person who has just heard something that changes the shape of the situation they've walked into. The fourth voice spoke for the first time. It was quieter than the others, considered, with a deliberateness that suggested it had been held back until this moment. There is the matter of the woman. Lyra went completely still. The music tutor. The voice continued, each word placed like stones in still water. Brought here under rather unusual circumstances, given the timing of her hire. Given a pause, what is being discussed in certain quarters about her potential influence over His Majesty's condition? Miss Whitlock is employed to teach the princess, Kaelor said. His voice had a new quality in it, harder. Employed at your personal direction, without standard household consultation, 3 days after the Mooncrest Ball at which she was present. The quiet voice did not inflect this as a question, which made it worse. The staff have noted that her evening playing correlates with periods of stability, which raises a question of whether she is a coincidental hire or something more deliberately strategic. What exactly are you suggesting? The temperature in the king's voice had dropped several degrees. The presence of an unvetted lowland woman in the heart of a frontier fortress, with apparent access to influence over the king's most vulnerable state, is a security matter regardless of its personal dimensions. The quiet voice, undeterred. The council would request that she be returned to the city while her background and connections are formally reviewed. Lyra's hands were tight on the book. Request denied, Kaelor said. Majesty. I heard the request. I denied it. We're finished for today. The sounds of the council breaking, the movement of chairs, the formal exchanges of departure, the footsteps of men leaving a room where they had not gotten what they came for and were recalibrating. Lyra pressed herself flat against the wall as though making herself thin would help, which it wouldn't, and she stayed there until the sounds resolved into distance and then silence. She walked back to the east wing very carefully, the book still in her hands, her mind working through what she'd heard with the same methodical calm she brought to difficult passages. Identify the problem, understand the structure, find the point where effort would have the most effect. The council thought she was a liability. They thought she was either a naive lowland woman in over her head or a strategic placement of unclear origin, and either version of that story ended with her being removed from the castle. The king had blocked the request today. He would not be able to block it indefinitely, not with a council already positioning itself for the possibility of a regency, not with 4 men in a room who had just watched him assert authority. He was, by their own accounting, losing the physical capacity to sustain, and underneath all of that, laid bare by the quiet voice with its carefully placed stones. They knew. Not just that the curse was progressing. They'd known that. They knew that her presence affected it. They knew that whatever happened when she played, when she touched his hand in the dark of that northern room, it was real and measurable, and it changed his condition in ways that were visible to trained observers, which meant she was not simply a piano tutor in a frontier fortress. She was the variable the council was trying to eliminate. She found Aveline in the library that evening. The princess was at the reading table with 2 books open in front of her and the expression of someone doing research they didn't want anyone to know they were doing. She looked up when Lyra entered, and whatever was in Lyra's face made her close both books immediately. "You heard the council," Aveline said. "Some of it." Lyra sat across from her. "They want me removed. They want a lot of things." Aveline's voice was flat, older than her face. "They've wanted a lot of things for 3 years. Kaelor has been blocking them. He won't be able to block them indefinitely." "No," Aveline agreed, and the single word carried the weight of someone who had spent 3 years watching the same thing Lyra was only beginning to see. "He won't." Lyra looked at the closed books on the table. "What were you researching?" A beat. Aveline looked at her with the assessing look she used when she was deciding how much to trust someone with something that mattered. Then she opened the bottom book to a marked page and turned it to face Lyra. It was old. The paper yellowed, the print dense and archaic in its construction. The heading on the open page read, in the formal scholarly language of a century past, "On the nature of the Virethorn bloodline. Affliction and its recorded interactions with true bond resonance." Lyra read it once, then read it again. The text was academic and careful, and not entirely direct in the way of scholars writing about things they weren't certain would be believed, hedged with "it has been reported" and "certain accounts suggest." But the substance of it, once the hedging was stripped away, was this: that the curse in the Virethorn Alpha bloodline was not simply a biological affliction. It was, according to accounts stretching back 4 generations, responsive. It intensified in isolation, and it was documented in at least 3 historical cases to have been temporarily suspended, or in one case significantly reversed, in the presence of a specific type of resonant bond. The text used the old language, true mate, the wolf's recognition of its counterpart, the bond that didn't choose and couldn't be argued with. The accounts described symptoms: a calm that the afflicted person couldn't produce alone, a cessation of the physical episodes, a quality of stillness in the Alpha's nature that outside observers noted as categorically different from controlled suppression, not management, but actual absence of the fury. Lyra set the book down. "When did you find this?" she asked. 3 months ago." Aveline's voice was very careful. "Before you came. I'd been looking for something, anything, that might—" She stopped, started again. "I wasn't looking for you specifically. I didn't know you existed. I needed there to be a possibility that wasn't just watching it get worse until it ends the same way it always ends." Lyra looked at the page, at the word resonant, at the phrase cessation of episodes in the documented presence of the bonded individual. "He doesn't know you found this," she said. "He knows the historical accounts exist. He's read everything ever written about the curse. He's been trying to understand it since he was 18, but he's—" Aveline searched for the word. "He's decided about what it means and what the options are. He decided before I found this account, and he doesn't revisit decisions easily." "What has he decided?" Aveline was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was with the precision of someone relaying something they'd heard directly. That the curse is what it is, that any connection he forms only creates another person in its path, that the only responsible thing to do with whatever time he has left in full capacity is to use it for Virethorn and protect the people around him from the consequences of what he'll eventually become. She looked at Lyra steadily. "He decided this before you danced with him at the ball, before you came here, before the episodes started responding to your music." A beat. "He hasn't changed his mind, but it's costing him more not to." Lyra sat with this. Outside the library windows, the mountain dark had fully settled, the peaks invisible now, just the black bulk of the forest against a sky thick with cloud. The fire in the library hearth crackled and shifted. Somewhere in the castle, a door closed. "If the council removes me," Lyra said slowly, working it through, "the episodes get worse." "Yes." "And if they get worse, the council's case for the regency becomes stronger." "Yes." "So removing me is actually the fastest path to what they want." Aveline looked at her with an expression that was tired and 17 and carrying more strategic awareness than most adults in the lowland cities Lyra had grown up in. Now you understand why I've been in the library. She went to him that night. Not an accident this time. No wrong turn, no meandering corridors. She walked deliberately to the door that connected to the north wing, pushed it open, and went through it, carrying a single candle and the green-bound volume of Frontier Ballads with Aveline's research tucked inside it. She found him in the North Wing study, a different room from the one she'd seen him in before, this one with a desk buried under maps and correspondence and the evidence of a man who ran a frontier kingdom with attention to every detail. He was standing at the window when she entered, and he turned at the sound of the door with a speed that would have frightened her if she hadn't already spent 9 days learning the shape of what he was. He looked at her for a moment, then at the candle, then at the book in her hands. "It's past the 9th bell," he said. "I know. You were told." "I know what I was told." She set the candle on the desk and placed the book beside it, open to Aveline's page. "I need 10 minutes. He looked at the book. Something happened in his face, a quick, barely visible tightening, recognition, the expression of a person encountering something they'd decided not to look at directly. "Where did you get that?" "Aveline, she's been in the library for 3 months. Lyra held his gaze. "She didn't tell you because she was afraid you'd already made up your mind, and she didn't want the argument." A silence. He looked at the page without moving toward it. "I've read the accounts," he said. "Years ago. And they're recorded by historians who are watching men losing their minds and looking for any evidence that there was something more hopeful happening." His voice was even, the argument inside it old and well-constructed. True bond resonance as a cure for a bloodline curse it's not documented in any medically rigorous. "The episodes stop when I play," Lyra said. "They stopped in the maze. They stopped when I held your hand. You know they stop. A temporary effect? A consistent one." She took a step toward the desk. "The council knows it too. That's why they want me gone." She watched his face. They were in that room today discussing a regency. They called the meeting early specifically because the curse is progressing and they're positioning for what comes after. And removing me is how they accelerate the timeline. She paused. I'm not telling you this I'm not asking you for anything personal. I'm telling you because you need to know the strategic situation clearly, and I think someone has been protecting you from the clearest version of it. The silence that followed was different from the others they'd shared. This one had a harder edge. The silence of a man whose careful architecture was being examined in light he hadn't chosen. "If I kept you here," he said slowly, "and the council pursued the removal formally, they'd have to bring it to the charter, which means a formal vote, which means a public record." Lyra had thought this through in the library, the same methodical way she'd thought through everything. And a public record means the border territories see a king who is actively defending his household against council interference, which reads as strength, not weakness. He looked at her. "You're not just a piano tutor," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't think I ever was." Something shifted in his expression, the old architecture giving slightly, under the weight of too many consistent things pointing in the same direction. He moved to the desk, looked down at the open page, and she saw him actually reading it this time, rather than looking at it with the practiced avoidance of someone who'd decided not to. "Lyra." He said her name with the same weight he'd given it in the maze the first time, the deliberate weight of something being named with intention. "If this is what it says it is." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked briefly. "Then what it asks of you is not—" Another stop. The sentence was not one he had the practice language for. "I know what it asks," she said. "You've been here 9 days." "I know. You came here because you needed work." "I know that too." She held his gaze and she did not look away, and she did not soften it with a smile or deflect it with lightness, because he was a man who read pretense immediately, and what she was offering him now was not pretense. It was the cleanest, truest version of something she'd been watching build in herself since a hedge maze and a waltz, and the weight of a hand that had steadied her before she knew she was falling. He looked at her for a long time. The fire in the study hearth was low, the light amber and close, and the mountains outside the window were invisible, just the dark, and the first shapes of cloud breaking to reveal a handful of stars. Then he took a breath that was different from the controlled ones she'd heard in the north wing room. Not management, not suppression. Something that went all the way in and all the way out. "The council meets again in 3 days," he said. "I expect they'll bring the formal removal request. Then we have 3 days to make it untenable." "How?" She picked up the Frontier Ballad collection, held it out to him. "Teach me the ones you marked," she said, "the ones from the old territory, and tell me what they mean. The real versions, not the translated ones. I want to understand what the music here is actually saying." He looked at the book for a moment. Then he reached out and took it from her, and she felt the warmth of his hand close to hers in the exchange, and the thing that had been building in the keep around them and between them. In 9 days of careful distance and evening music and a single pre-dawn crossing of a stone floor, that thing had its own gravity now, and both of them felt it. He opened the book to the first marked page. "Sit down," he said. "This one has 7 verses." Oh, 3 days was not enough time, and it was exactly enough time. The lesson that had begun as strategy became something else within an hour. The particular alchemy of music shared in a small room in the middle of the night, the way a language opens between people who are genuinely listening to each other. He knew these songs from childhood, knew the versions that hadn't been written down, the breathing and the rhythm, and the way the words had been shaped by the mountains they came from. And she could hear what they were doing, could hear inside the structure to the thing the structure was built to carry. They worked through all 3 marked pieces before the fire died down, and when they finished the last one, the silence afterward was the kind that exists between musicians who have played something together and are still inside it. "You understand it," he said, and the surprise in his voice was genuine. The particular surprise of a man who had not expected to be understood. "I've spent my life learning to hear what people are actually saying when they play," she said. "This says, we survive because we don't forget what we're surviving for." He looked at her across the low fire. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what it says." On the morning of the 3rd day, Mare appeared at Lyra's door before breakfast, with an expression that had moved beyond its usual managed neutrality into something that, on a less controlled face, might have been called alarm. "The council is convening in 1 hour," Mare said, "and Lord Casson—" The quiet voice from the hearing, she meant, the one who had named Lyra specifically, arrived last night with 2 men I don't recognize. They're not household staff and they weren't announced. Lyra looked at her. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mara said with the precision of 30 years in frontier households, "that someone came prepared for the possibility that the formal request might be refused." The cold thing in Lyra's chest sharpened into something specific. "Where is the king?" "In the receiving hall. The council meeting has already begun." Marit paused, and what crossed her face in that pause was something that surprised Lyra. Something that looked like a decision being made in real time. "The music room window," she said, "faces the inner courtyard. Anyone in the courtyard could hear clearly what is played in that room." Lyra stared at her. "The council chamber is above the courtyard. The east side of it has 3 open windows," Marit said, her voice completely even. "Given the morning air." A silence. "How long?" Lyra said carefully. "Have you known about the episodes responding to music?" "Long enough," Marit said, and then she stepped back from the doorway and walked away down the corridor, and her footsteps were the brisk, purposeful ones of someone who has done what they came to do. Lyra stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back into her room, changed her dress, took the Frontier Ballad book from the desk, and went to the music room. The piano was exactly as she'd left it. The morning light came through the east-facing windows at the angle that made the keys look almost warm. She could hear, from above and to the left, the distant murmur of the council in session, the cadence of formal deliberation, the flat tones of men who had prepared their arguments. She sat down. She placed her hands on the keys. She played the first of the Frontier Ballads, the real version, the one he'd shown her in the firelit study, the one with 7 verses and the weight of a mountain people's entire philosophy of survival in it. She played it the way she'd learned it 3 nights ago, The way he'd hummed the old melody over her shoulder and corrected the phrasing until it breathed like the original. And she played it out the open windows into the courtyard and up through the stone and air toward the council chamber above. She didn't know if it would work. She didn't know if it would matter. She knew that the man in that room above her had been fighting alone for 3 years, and the council meeting today was not really about her at all. It was about whether Virethorn's king would survive long enough to be the king. And she knew that she had found, in 9 days and 3 nights and 1 book of mountain songs, the thing she had been moving toward since a carriage rolled through keep gates and stone walls closed around her. And she had felt, despite every rational objection, that she was arriving somewhere rather than just leaving something. She played the 2nd verse, then the 3rd. Above her, the murmur of the council went on. Then it stopped. Not the casual stop of a break in deliberation, the abrupt, total stop of something interrupted by something else. A voice she knew, his, cut through the stone with a clarity that meant he was standing, that he had risen from whatever position he'd been sitting in, that something in him had changed register entirely. She played the 4th verse and didn't stop. The sounds from above reorganized themselves. Footsteps. His, she knew them now, crossing the floor of the council chamber. The scrape of a chair, another voice rising, objecting, and then cutting off abruptly in the way things cut off when the person they're objecting to has left the room. The music room door opened behind her. She kept playing. She finished the 4th verse, moved into the 5th, felt the music doing what it was built to do, carrying its meaning without apology, the survival and the memory and the refusal to forget what you were surviving for. He stood in the doorway. She knew it was him from the quality of the silence behind her, the particular stillness that she had learned to recognize as his. She reached the 7th verse, played it through to the end, let the last chord ring and decay in the stone room. The silence after was complete. "You walked out of the council meeting," she said, not turning around. "Yes." His voice was different. The control still there, but underneath it something that had been compressed for a very long time was no longer compressed. "They'll formalize the removal request without you in the room." "They already have." Casson read it into the charter record 20 minutes ago. A pause. "It requires my countersignature to be void. I have not given it." Another pause. Heavier. "I also have not given it because I was sitting in that room listening to men argue about what to do with whatever I'm becoming, and then you started playing, and I—" He stopped. The sentence had no trained ending. Lyra lifted her hands from the keys and turned on the bench. He was standing in the doorway exactly as Aveline had once stood, filling the frame, the light from the corridor behind him, his face in the expression she'd last seen in the firelit study 3 nights ago, the architecture giving way, the old decisions feeling, in the clarity of this morning, like they had been made by a man who had not yet been in a room with her. "The council," she said carefully, "has 2 unannounced men in the castle that Marais doesn't recognize." Something shifted in his expression, fast, the way threat registers before the mind has fully processed it. "Where?" The word came out in the stripped, immediate register she'd heard once before in the North Wing room. Marais didn't know. She said they arrived with Cassin last night. He was already moving back through the doorway when Aveline appeared from the East Wing corridor at a near run, her face carrying an expression that Lyra had never seen on it before. The expression of a 17-year-old who had finally run out of practiced composure. "They're in my rooms," Aveline said, breathing fast. 2 men. They said they were there on council authority. Kaylor—" He was gone before she finished the sentence. Moving through the corridor with the speed and absolute silence of something that had stopped managing its own nature and was operating on something older and more direct, and the air in the corridor behind him seemed to change in his absence. Not emptier, but different, charged with the echo of what had just passed through it. Lyra stood, looked at Aveline. Aveline looked back at her, and in the space between them was the same understanding. Whatever was happening in the East Wing, whatever 2 unannounced men in the princess's rooms meant, whatever Cassin's preparation for refusal had actually involved, it was no longer a council meeting. It was something else entirely. Lyra crossed the music room floor and went through the door and into the corridor after him, and behind her the piano strings still held the last vibration of the frontier ballad in the cold mountain air, ringing down slowly toward silence. The corridor outside the music room was empty when Lyra stepped into it, but the evidence of the king's passage was there in the quality of the air, that charged, altered stillness, like the atmosphere after lightning has moved through it. She followed it toward the east wing with the same instinct that had moved her across the north wing floor 3 weeks ago, the same body-level certainty that the correct thing to do was not to stop. Aveline was 2 steps behind her. Neither of them spoke. They heard it before they saw it. Not shouting, not the sounds of violence, but something more unnerving than either. Complete silence from the direction of the princess's rooms. The kind of silence that follows the sudden removal of sound rather than its absence from the beginning. The kind that meant something had happened and had finished happening and was waiting for what came next. The door to Aveline's rooms was open. The 2 men Marais had flagged were in the outer sitting room, and they were standing very still against the far wall, with the posture of people who had made a professional calculation and concluded with some speed that the professional calculation had been wrong. They were not small men. Whatever they had been hired to do, escort, persuade, remove by force if persuasion failed, they had the build and the stillness of people who did those things for a living and did not typically find them difficult. They looked, at this particular moment, as though they were reconsidering their career. Kaelor stood in the center of the room. He had not touched either of them. That was the first thing Lyra registered, and the second was that he didn't need to. The thing she had seen only in fragments before, in the north wing floor at dawn, in the corridor moving away from the music room, was fully present now, and it was not the curse, or not only the curse. It was the king. The Virethorn Alpha, in full authority, the man who had walked into a council chamber at 21 and told 4 border lords to say their objections to his face or not at all. The man who had held a frontier kingdom together by himself for 3 years against a bloodline curse and a council with knives behind their courtesy. That man, standing in a 16-year-old girl's sitting room in the morning light, communicating without a word spoken that whatever directive had brought these 2 men to this room was finished. "Names," he said. The taller of the 2 men gave them. His voice was flat and professional, the voice of someone maintaining dignity through practical efficiency. "Who hired you?" A pause. A calculation. "Lord Cassin, Majesty. Through a private arrangement." "What were your instructions?" Another pause, longer. The man looked at his companion briefly, the quick, sideways look of people deciding how much truth was currently in their interest. Then he looked back at the king. "To escort Miss Whitlock from the premises. If she refused escort, to ensure she departed." "By what means?" Silence. "By what means?" Kaelor said again, and his voice had not risen, had not changed tempo or register, but something in the room changed when he said it the second time, something that had nothing to do with volume. Lord Cassin indicated that discretion was, "Answer the question." "Whatever means necessary," the man said, and then, with the slightly defensive precision of someone establishing that they personally find their assignment distasteful, "We weren't told she was, we weren't given the full picture of the situation." The full picture of the situation. Lyra felt that land somewhere cold in her chest. Not fear, or not primarily fear. Anger, cleaner than fear, the kind that clarifies rather than paralyzes. She had been right in the library. She had been right in the music room. Cassin had not come to this meeting to deliberate. He had come to execute a plan he'd already made, and the deliberation was the cover for the execution, and the 2 men against the wall were the part of the plan that ran whether the deliberation succeeded or not. "You'll leave the keep," Kaelor said. "Now, through the main gates, where the garrison will log your exit. If either of you is on Virethorn territory after sundown, I'll have you detained for questioning under the Territorial Security Charter." He paused. "Tell Cassin he'll be hearing from me directly." The men left. They left quickly, with the efficiency of people who have decided that speed is the most dignified option remaining to them, and the sound of their boots in the corridor diminished and disappeared, and the room was quiet. Aveline let out a breath that she'd clearly been holding since the corridor. They were in my rooms, she said, and the flat precision of it was the voice she used when she was managing something large by keeping her expression small. They were in my rooms going through my books. Kaelor turned to his sister, and what moved across his face at that, the brief, unguarded thing before the control reasserted itself, was something Lyra had not seen in him before. Rage, yes, but underneath it something older and more basic. A brother. A person for whom the threat to the person they were supposed to protect was simply unbearable in a way that bypassed every other consideration. "Are you hurt?" "No, I came in and they were there and I left." A beat. "I was coming to find you." He nodded. The nod of someone filing something away for later when the immediate situation resolved. He looked around the room, at the books slightly disordered on the shelf near the window, the writing desk where papers had been moved and replaced with the telltale imprecision of a hasty search. Then he looked at Lyra. She held his gaze. She didn't offer a version of what had just happened that was softer than what it was, because he didn't need that and it would have been an insult to offer it. "Cassin was looking for the research," she said. "Avalon's research. The historical accounts." His jaw tightened. "If he has documentation that there's a recorded mechanism for the curse responding to, then he has evidence that removing me is strategically urgent. For him." Lyra finished the sentence because the logic was clean, and he needed to hear it said plainly. "The research doesn't just document that the bond might help you. It documents that without it, the progression accelerates, which means I'm not a liability from the Council's perspective. I'm the thing standing between you and the timeline they need." The silence that followed this was the kind that happens when a truth has been said in a room and everyone in the room is absorbing the full weight of it simultaneously. "He'll bring the removal request back to the charter," Kaelor said. "Today. Possibly within the hour." "Then we don't give him the hour." He looked at her. "What are you proposing?" Lyra thought about Mare and the music room window and the courtyard and the council chamber above. She thought about the two men against the wall and the search of Aveline's rooms and the particular precision of a plan that had been designed around the assumption that she could be managed out of this situation quietly. She thought about 3 weeks of being watched and evaluated and found wanting and the long history. Longer than 3 weeks, longer than Virethorn, reaching back to a ballroom and a hedge maze and a mother's kitchen table and 2 minutes crying in the dark. The long history of people arranging things around her and expecting her to stay arranged. She was very tired of being arranged. "I'm proposing," she said, "that we stop playing defense." They found Cassin in the receiving hall. He was still there. The other 3 council members had departed, but Cassin had remained, and he was seated at the long table with the charter document open in front of him and the expression of a man who had been waiting with the patience of someone who believed he already knew how the morning ended. He looked up when the 3 of them entered. Kaelor first, then Lyra, then Aveline a step behind, and the calculation in his face was quick and almost invisible. Almost. He stood, formal, correct. "Majesty, I was hoping to continue our discussion." "The men you brought have left the premises," Kaelor said, a barely perceptible stillness. "I'm not certain what men you're referring to." "Deneth and Cray, hired through your private household in the city." Kaelor moved to the near end of the table and stood there without sitting, which meant Cassin was required to either remain standing or sit down while the king stood, and either option had a different problem. Cassin remained standing. Their instructions, per their own account, were to remove Miss Whitlock by whatever means necessary. "That is a significant mischaracterization of Lord Cassin." Kaelor's voice was very even. "I've been patient with this council for 3 years. I understand the concerns about the succession. I understand the political logic of what you've been working toward. But sending private men into my fortress to remove a member of my household while I was occupied in the meeting you called for that purpose." The sentence didn't finish in words. It finished in the quality of the silence he left after it. Cassin looked at him for a long moment. Then his eyes moved to Lyra. A brief, assessing look that evaluated and categorized and did not bother to disguise itself as anything other than what it was. "The woman is the problem," he said, and the bluntness of it, the dropping of the diplomatic register, told her that he had also decided to stop playing defense. Not personally, structurally. Whatever is happening between your condition and her presence, and I've had 3 physicians review the garrison reports, so let's not pretend I don't know what I'm looking at. It's an unmanaged variable at the heart of the most strategically sensitive territory on the frontier. If she is what the old accounts suggest she might be, she is, Kaelor said. Cassin stopped. The room stopped. Lyra felt it. The particular shift of a room when the thing that everyone has been discussing in careful, indirect language is named directly and without qualification. She felt Aveline go very still behind her. She felt the warmth of the king's presence at her left, the solid certainty of him, and she kept her own face calm and her breathing steady, because this was not the moment for anything that looked like reaction. Then you understand, Cassin said, recovering, why the council cannot simply... I understand that you came to this meeting with a plan that did not include the possibility of my refusal, Kaelor said. I understand that your fallback was to remove her while I was occupied so that the question became moot before I could act on it. And I understand that you have spent the past 3 years managing the question of my succession with the assumption that eventually the curse would make the decision for you. A pause, controlled and deliberate. You assumed I would become something that couldn't protect what matters to me. That assumption is what today was built on. Cassin's expression shifted. Something in it, not softening, but recalibrating, the way a strategist recalibrates when new information enters the calculation. The historical accounts of true bond resonance, he said carefully, are not medically verified. The possibility that it could affect the bloodline curse is, it already has. Kaelor said it simply, without drama, the way someone states something they've watched happen over sufficient time that the evidence no longer requires argument. Every episode in the past 3 weeks has been shorter, less severe, and controllable in ways that the previous pattern did not allow for. The garrison physician has the documentation. You're welcome to review it. A beat. I imagine your 3 physicians already have. The silence that followed was longer than the previous ones. Cassin was thinking, genuinely, carefully, the way an intelligent man thinks when the ground has shifted and the map he came in with no longer matches the terrain. He looked at Lyra again, and this time the look was different. Not warmer. Cassin was not a man who did warm, but more direct. The look of someone reevaluating what they're actually dealing with. What you're proposing, Cassin said slowly, is that she stays. What I'm telling you, Kaelor said, is that she stays. And the council's concerns about an unvetted, then vet her. Lyra spoke for the first time since they'd entered the room, and the sound of her own voice in the formal receiving hall was steadier than she'd expected. Both men looked at her. She held the position. You have concerns about my background and my connections, and whether I represent a security risk. Those are legitimate concerns for a frontier council to have about anyone in proximity to the king. So address them through the proper channels. Request the review. Conduct it thoroughly. I'll cooperate with every part of it. She held Cassin's gaze. But do it through the charter process, not through private men with instructions I wasn't informed of. If I'm going to be evaluated, I want it on record. The room was very quiet. Cassin looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the king. Then he looked at the charter document open on the table in front of him, and something in his expression underwent a slow, visible adjustment. The adjustment of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit the category he put it in and is deciding whether to find a new category or simply acknowledge that the categories were wrong. A formal review, he said, conducted by the full council. Transparent record. Yes, Lyra said, and in the interim. She remains in the keep, Kaelor said. Not a negotiation, a statement. Cassin was quiet for several seconds. Long enough that Lyra became aware of the morning light moving across the stone floor, the faint sounds of the keep operating around this still room, the mountain wind against the high windows. 3 weeks, Cassin said. The review will take 3 weeks. During that time, the removal request is suspended pending outcome. He picked up the charter document and rolled it closed. I will need to inform the other council members. Inform them, Kaelor said. Cassin looked at him one more time. Then he looked at Lyra. And this look, the last one, was different from all the previous ones. Not the strategic calculation, not the evaluation of a liability, something quieter, something that was almost in its way a kind of recognition. The look of a man who had come in certain and was leaving with slightly less certainty and was honest enough with himself to know the difference. He left. The receiving hall doors closed behind him. The quiet that followed was enormous and slightly unreal, the way quiet feels after sustained noise, too big for the space, filling it in ways that took a moment to adjust to. Aveline sat down in one of the council chairs with the focused absence of expression of someone running on adrenaline that has just finished its job. Lyra stood in the middle of the room with her hands at her sides and breathed. "A formal review," Aveline said to the ceiling. "That was actually good." "It takes the informal option away from him," Lyra said. "If it's on record, whatever he finds has to be presented transparently. He can't use it the way he used this morning." "He may find things to present," Kaylor said. He was standing at the window now, looking out over the courtyard, the morning light falling across him at the angle that showed the lines around his eyes, and the particular quality of exhaustion that lived in a person who had been fighting on too many fronts for too long. "Your family's financial situation is not invisible to a thorough investigation. The broken engagement will be part of the record." "I know," Lyra said. "Casson will frame it as vulnerability. Someone who came here with nothing to lose and therefore potentially motivated by—" "I know," she said again more quietly. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the directness of it, the absence of any of the careful management, the stripped-down version of him that she'd first seen on the North Wing floor, was present again. "You don't have to do this," he said. "The review, the record, if it becomes a problem for you publicly, if it follows you, it won't be worse than what I was already looking at when I left that ball," she said. "That's not the same as saying it won't be difficult." "No," she agreed. "But I've been managing difficult things by myself for a long time. At least this one—" She stopped. He waited. "At least this one matters," she finished, and the honesty of it sat in the room between them, simple and irrevocable, the kind of true thing that can't be unsaid and doesn't need to be. The 3 weeks of the review were the strangest and most complete period of Lyra's life. Strange because she was being formally investigated by a frontier territorial council while simultaneously giving daily piano lessons to the king's sister and playing evening music through the stone walls of a mountain fortress. And the juxtaposition of those two things had a quality she might have found farcical if she'd had more distance from it. Complete because in all the careful architecture of her lowland city life, the correct smiles and the social calculations and the long management of expectations, she had never felt, not once, fully present in the way she felt in those 3 weeks. As though she'd been operating at a fraction of herself her entire life and had only now, in the most unlikely possible location, come into the full version. The council's investigator arrived on the 4th day, a thin man named Soren with small, careful eyes and a leather document case that he carried everywhere and never set down, as though he expected it to be interfered with if his hands weren't on it. He interviewed Lyra 3 times in the first week. He interviewed her mother by correspondence. He spoke with Murray and with 3 of the keep's senior staff, and on the 10th day with Aveline, an interview that Aveline reported afterward with grim satisfaction, having apparently answered every question with the precision and detail of someone who had been preparing for exactly this. "He asked me whether I thought your presence in the keep was beneficial," Aveline told her, in the music room in the middle of a lesson she was clearly too distracted to concentrate on. "What did you say?" "I said that my piano playing had improved by approximately 200% in 3 weeks, and that for the first time in 2 years I had heard my brother sleep through an entire night without waking." She said it without inflection, watching her own hands on the keys. "I also said that if the council removed you and the episodes got worse, and Virethorn lost its king to a curse that your presence was actively managing, I would hold each member of the council personally accountable in whatever way I had available to me when I was old enough to have the authority to do so." Lyra looked at her. "I'm 17 in 2 months," Aveline said. "I have opinions." The episodes continued during the review. Not worse than before, nothing like the severity of the North Wing floor that first morning, but present, intermittent, the bloodline doing what it did regardless of politics. On the 2nd week's worst night, Lyra heard the sounds from the North Tower again and sat at the upright in her sitting room and played for 2 hours straight the frontier ballads and then the pieces she knew by heart, and then, at the end, The one she'd been composing herself in the quiet hours between lessons. A piece without a name yet, built from the structure of the mountain songs he'd taught her, but shaped by something she hadn't put a name to either. The sounds stopped. She kept playing. At some point past the second hour, she became aware that the door to her sitting room was open. He stood in the doorway. He'd clearly come from the North Tower. The coat was absent, the shirt rough and untucked in the way of someone who had dressed with a different priority than appearance. He looked exhausted and present, both at once, the way people look when something has stripped away everything that isn't essential, and what remains is simply the person without their architecture. "You don't need to play the full night," he said. "I wasn't doing it as a service," she said without stopping. "I was doing it because I wanted to." He stood there for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair near the small fire, and she played, and the room held both of them in the amber light, and outside the windows the mountain dark was complete and full of stars. "The piece you're playing," he said after a while. "Is that one of the territorial songs?" "No, it's new." "What is it about?" She thought about it. The honest version, not the managed one. "Finding out what you're actually made of when everything else is gone," she said, "and being surprised that it's enough." He was quiet for a moment. "It sounds like you know that already." "I'm learning it." She played the last phrase through to the end, set her hands in her lap, turned to look at him, and he was looking at her with the expression that she had no trained name for but had come to recognize as the one that was entirely his, the one underneath all the others, the one that didn't perform anything. "Kylor," she said, using his name for the first time without the title, and the word fit in her mouth differently than anything she'd said in a long time, simple and weighty and real. He didn't correct her. "I know what the review will find," she said. "I've thought about it carefully. The financial situation, the broken engagement, the fact that I came here with nothing and am now in the center of the keep's most sensitive political situation. Casson will present it as opportunism or naivety or both, and he'll be wrong about what it means, but he won't be wrong about the facts." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that I know that, and I want you to know that none of it is the reason I'm here." "I know why you're here," he said. "I'm not certain you do," she said. "Not the full version." He looked at her. "I'm here," she said, carefully and completely, "because when you held my hand in a hedge maze, I stopped falling, and I hadn't known until that moment how long I'd been falling. And because when you played music with me in a firelit room for 7 verses of a mountain song, I understood something I'd been reaching for my entire life without knowing what it was." She stopped, breathed. "I'm here because you are the most honest thing I've encountered in 23 years of people telling me which version of myself to perform, and I would rather deal with everything this situation contains than go back to performing any version of myself that isn't the real one." The fire crackled. Outside, the mountain held its enormous silence. He crossed the distance between the chair and the piano bench in 3 steps, and he knelt in front of her the way she had knelt in front of him on the north wing floor, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them. He took her hands in both of his, not the careful formal hold of the ballroom dance or the desperate steadying of the dark floor, but something entirely different, something deliberate, something that had thought about itself and arrived here on purpose. "The review ends in 4 days," he said. "Whatever Casson presents, I will counter." "I know." "And after that?" "I know that too," she said. "We'll figure it out." Something that was genuinely a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Real, unguarded, the kind she suspected he didn't produce often or for audiences. "You're remarkably calm about this." "I'm not calm," she said. "I'm making a decision, and then I'm going to be calm about it afterward. There's a difference." He laughed. It was a short sound, quiet, slightly unused, the laugh of a man who'd been serious for so long that humor felt slightly foreign. But it was real, and she felt it in her chest like the resonant note of a string struck at exactly the right pitch. His hands were warm around hers, and the thing inside him, the thing she'd been listening to through stone walls and managing through music, and learning to understand with the same trained attention she brought to everything she loved, that thing was completely still. The review concluded on the 18th day. Soren delivered his findings to the full council in a closed session that Lyra was not present for, and she spent that morning teaching Aveline the piece without a name, and they played it together through from beginning to end without stopping for the first time. And when it was done, Aveline sat quietly for a moment and then said, with her characteristic directness, "That's about him, isn't it?" "Yes," Lyra said. "Does he know?" "I think so." "Good," Aveline said. And then she began to play it again from the beginning, and Lyra listened with her whole attention and felt the particular fullness of a person who has arrived somewhere real after a very long time of being almost somewhere. The council sent their response that afternoon. Murray delivered it personally, which told Lyra the content before she opened it. Murray, in 30 years of careful management, had never personally delivered routine correspondence. The letter was brief, formal. Cassin's signature at the bottom, and 3 others. Following a thorough review of Miss Lyra Whitlock's background, connections, and conduct during her time at Virethorn Keep, the High Territorial Council finds no evidence of security risk or improper influence. The formal removal request is hereby withdrawn from the charter record. Miss Whitlock's continued residence and employment at Virethorn Keep is confirmed, subject to the standard terms of royal household appointment. Lyra read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and sat with the weight of it. Not the relief exactly, though that was present. Something larger. The particular feeling of a thing that has been fought for actually arriving, the gap between the fighting and the having that is sometimes so wide that the arrival is almost surprising. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Aveline's. She knew them now, the quick, purposeful rhythm of them. Then a knock at the door, perfunctory, the kind that was really just notification that she was entering. "Well?" Aveline said. Lyra handed her the letter. Aveline read it. Her face, always so carefully managed, went through something complex and quick. Relief, and something fiercer underneath it, and then the settled expression of someone who has been holding a weight for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "Cassin actually signed it," she said. "He did." "He's not done," Aveline said, because she was 17 and had been living in this keep and watching this council for 3 years, and she knew the shape of long games better than most adults did. "This is a tactical retreat. He'll find another angle." "I know," Lyra said. "But for today, Lyra agreed. "It's enough." Aveline set the letter on the desk and looked at her sister-in-law. Not yet, not technically, not in any form the charter would currently recognize, but with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who knew exactly what was coming and had already made her peace with it. "He's in the North Garden," she said. "He goes there when things resolve. He won't say he's waiting, but he is." Lyra stood, straightened her dress, and went to find him. The North Garden was a small, walled space off the keep's main corridor. Not formal, not decorative, just a square of mountain earth with a few stubborn plants that survived the altitude and a stone bench against the eastern wall where the sun hit in the late afternoon. He was sitting on the bench when she came through the gate, forearms on his knees, looking at the mountains visible above the wall's edge. The late light made the peaks look warmer than they were. He didn't turn at the sound of the gate, but she knew from the shift in his posture that he'd heard it. She crossed the small garden and sat beside him on the bench, and he handed her a folded piece of paper. A second copy of the letter, she realized when she opened it. "Maret makes copies of everything," he said. "I noticed." She folded it back and held it in her lap. "Aveline says it's a tactical retreat." "She's right." "But for today." "For today," he said, and turned to look at her, and the late mountain light was on his face, and the wolf inside him was completely still, and she thought, with a clarity that had nothing careful in it, that had set down all its management and simply knew, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She leaned her shoulder against his, and he let the weight of her settle there, and above them the mountains went gold, and then rose, and then deep blue as the afternoon moved toward evening, and for the first time in longer than either of them could precisely remember, there was no storm coming. The stillness held for 2 weeks. Not the brittle stillness of suppression, not the managed quiet of a man holding himself together through technique and will. The real kind. The kind that didn't require maintenance. Kaler slept through full nights for the first time in 3 years, and the garrison physician documented it with the careful precision of a man who had been recording deterioration for so long that he had forgotten what improvement looked like, and was learning the notation from scratch. The episodes that had been occurring with increasing frequency and severity simply stopped. Not reduced, not attenuated. Stopped, the way a storm stops when the pressure system that generated it has moved on. Lyra knew it was the bond. She had known it since Aveline's library, since the old accounts with their careful academic hedging, since the first night she'd played the frontier ballads out the music room window, and felt in the quality of the silence afterward that she had reached something that reached back. The bond was not a metaphor. It was not sentiment dressed in formal language by historians who wanted it to be true. It was a specific, documentable, physiological fact, and it was working. And the garrison physician's records were the evidence that Cassin had built his strategy around the wrong conclusion. She thought about this with the part of her mind that never fully switched off, the practical part, the part that had made lists at a kitchen table in a ball gown and understood that problems did not resolve themselves through feeling, but through clear sight and correct action. The tactical retreat was real. Cassin had signed the letter, the formal removal request was off the charter record, and the 3 weeks of the review had established, publicly and with documentation, that she was not a liability. But Aveline was right. It was a retreat, not a surrender. Cassin was an intelligent man who had been working toward a specific outcome for 3 years. And intelligent men who have been working toward specific outcomes do not abandon them because of a single unfavorable result. They find new angles. She kept her eyes open. Well, the new angle arrived in the form of a letter on a Tuesday morning at the beginning of Lyra's 6th week at Virethorn Keep. It came addressed to the king, not to her, and she only knew about it because Aveline intercepted Maret's copy. Maret made copies of everything, as established, and appeared in the doorway of the music room during Lyra's morning practice hour with the look she wore when something required immediate attention and she was deciding how to frame it. Cassin has written to the King's Council of the Lowland Territories, Aveline said, sitting down on the bench beside the piano without invitation. Not just the Virethorn border lords, the full territorial body. All 12 seats. Lyra lifted her hands from the keys. What does the letter say? Aveline unfolded the copy. She'd been 17 for 4 days, and she read with the flat precision of someone who had decided that the correct way to handle difficult information was to read it exactly as it was and not perform a reaction. He's formally petitioned for an extraordinary council session. The petition cites, and I'm reading this directly, evidence of undue influence over the ruling Alpha of Virethorn by an individual of unestablished lineage, raising concerns about the stability and security of frontier governance that extend beyond the territorial boundaries of Virethorn itself and require the attention of the full territorial body. The music room was very quiet. He's taking it beyond Virethorn, Lyra said. He's taking it to the body that has jurisdictional authority over all 12 frontier territories, including the right to review the fitness of any territorial ruler. Aveline folded the letter with the careful deliberateness of someone giving her hands a task to do while her mind worked. If he can get a majority of the 12 seats to call an extraordinary session, Kaelor can't simply refuse it the way he refused the Virethorn Council. It's a different authority. What's the timeline? The petition requires a response from 6 seats within 30 days. He sent it to 12. He only needs 6. Aveline looked at her. He's been building toward this. The Virethorn Council meeting, the review, the men in my rooms, all of it was preliminary. He was watching to see whether Kaelor would choose you over managing the council. And he did, and now Cassin has the evidence he needs for a broader case. A pause. The evidence is the garrison physician's records. Lyra frowned. The records show the curse responding positively. How does he use that against? He's not framing it as the curse responding positively. He's framing it as the king's physical and psychological state having become dependent on the presence of a specific unvetted individual, creating a vulnerability that any enemy of the frontier could exploit. Aveline's voice was careful and precise and tired in the way of someone who had been watching political chess for 3 years and was exhausted by how good the players on the wrong side were. It's not false, exactly. It's a version of true that's been turned 90 degrees. Lyra sat with that. Outside the music room windows, the mountain morning was clear and cold, the kind of cold that had a specific quality in the high territories. Not the damp gray cold of the lowland cities, but something clean and direct, cold, that told you where you were without apology. How much time do we have before Kylor sees this letter? He already has it, Aveline said. Mairead gave him the original an hour ago. A beat. He's in the North Garden. He was not sitting this time. He was standing at the far wall of the North Garden with his back to the gate, looking at the mountains, and the set of his shoulders told her the thing she needed to know about how he'd received the letter before she said a word. She closed the gate behind her and crossed the small space and stood beside him, and he turned his head slightly to acknowledge her presence without turning away from the mountains. "You've read it," she said. "Yes." Aveline showed me the copy. Of course she did. A brief, almost dry note in his voice. Not quite humor, but the shape of it. Then it faded. He has a case. I want to be honest with you about that. The framing is deliberately adversarial, but the underlying argument isn't completely without merit. The territorial body has legitimate jurisdiction and genuine responsibility for frontier stability, and a ruling alpha whose condition has created a dependency on a specific individual is, from a pure governance standpoint, a security question worth asking. You're arguing his side, Lyra said. I'm telling you the truth about the strength of his position so you understand what we're actually dealing with. He turned to face her fully now, and his expression had the quality it always had when he was being absolutely direct with her. Stripped of management, stripped of performance, just the fact of what he was thinking, presented without decoration. If 6 territorial lords respond to that petition, the extraordinary session is called. And in an extraordinary session, the council has the authority to impose conditions on my governance, including conditions about who is and isn't permitted in the keep. They can force me out, Lyra said. Legally, within the charter, yes. He held her gaze. Which means that everything I did to keep you here, blocking the original request, the review, the counter, gets overridden by a body whose jurisdiction I can't refuse without triggering a constitutional crisis that would destabilize the entire frontier. Lyra breathed in the cold morning air. How many of the 12 territorial lords does Cassin have relationships with? At least 4 who would vote his direction on instinct. He needs 6. He's looking for 2 more who can be convinced by the petition's logic. A pause. He'll have 30 days to work on them. Then we have 30 days. Lyra's 30 days, she said again. What do the other 8 lords know about what's actually been happening here? About the garrison records? The real interpretation of them? Not Cassin's 90-degree version? He was quiet for a moment. The answer in the silence before he spoke it, not enough. The records are internal Virethorn documentation. I've shared them with the Virethorn Council members as part of ongoing governance reporting. The broader territorial body receives summary reports, not detailed medical documentation. Then we give them the detailed documentation. We can't send private medical records to 12 territorial lords as a counterpetition before, not as a counterpetition. Lyra was working it through as she spoke, the same way she worked through a difficult musical passage. Identify the structure, find the point where effort produces the most change. As a briefing, as the King of Virethorn proactively sharing information about his own governance and the status of his health, which is a legitimate thing for a territorial ruler to do with the body that has oversight responsibility for him. Not reactive, not defensive. Proactive. She looked at him. Cassin gets to the 12 lords with a petition that frames this as a crisis. You get there first with a briefing that frames it as a situation that is actively improving, documented, and being managed responsibly. He looked at her for a long moment. It turns the 90 degrees back, she said. The same information faced the right direction. The silence that followed was the thinking kind. She could see it in him. The rapid, ordered consideration of someone with genuine strategic intelligence processing a new approach against all the known variables. He turned back to the mountains briefly, and she waited, because she'd learned that his silences were working silences and interrupting them was counterproductive. I would need to address the dependency question directly, he said, not avoid it. Yes? Which means formally acknowledging in documentation sent to 12 territorial lords that my condition is affected by a specific individual. Yes. She kept her voice steady, and that the effect is positive, documented, and consistent, and that the individual in question has undergone a full counsel review and been cleared. A beat. You're not hiding a vulnerability. You're describing a managed condition with an identified stabilizing factor. That's not the same thing. He turned back to her. The moment I put that in writing, I've formally acknowledged the nature of the bond to a body that will understand what it means. I know. Which means I've formally acknowledged what you are to me, in a document that becomes part of the territorial charter record. I know that too. His eyes held hers. You understand that once it's in that record, Kaelor. She said his name with the same weight she always gave it, the weight that had made him not correct her the first time she'd used it. I know what it means. I've known what it means since Aveline's library. I'm not asking you to do this without understanding the implications for both of us. She stepped closer. I'm asking you to stop protecting me from a future I've already decided I want. The morning held them, cold and clear and absolute. Above the garden wall, the mountain peaks were sharp white against blue sky, the kind of blue that only existed at altitude, too clean for the lower world. He reached out and took her face in both hands, the same hands that had steadied her in a hedge maze, that had reached for hers in the dark of the north wing floor, that had held hers in a firelit study over 7 verses of a mountain song. And he looked at her with the expression that had no trained name, the one underneath all the others. I'll write the briefing, he said. The briefing took 4 days to compose. Lyra knew this because she helped compose it, not the formal legal language. That was Kaelor and the keep's charter clerk working through the night in the study. But the framing, the narrative logic, the part that required someone who understood how a document needed to breathe in order to be believed rather than simply read. She sat across the study desk from him on the second night, the fire low, both of them with cups of cold tea they'd forgotten to drink, and she read each section as he drafted it and told him when the language was protecting itself too much, when the careful governance register was creating distance from the thing that actually needed to be said. This paragraph, she said on the third night, pointing to a section in the middle of the document. You've written around it. The core thing is there, the bond, the documented effect on the episodes, but you've put so much careful qualification around it that a reader can choose to not understand it if they don't want to. He read it. The qualification is accurate. The qualification is armor, she said. And armor in a document that's supposed to be proactively honest reads as defensiveness, which reads as weakness. She held his gaze. Say it plainly. You found your true mate. The bond is real and documented. The curse is responding. That's what happened. Let them read it without an exit. He looked at her for a long moment across the desk with its accumulated papers and cold tea and the evidence of 3 days of careful work. Then he looked at the paragraph. Then he picked up his pen and rewrote it from the beginning in 4 sentences, clean and unqualified, the way he spoke when he decided something was true and had stopped arguing with it. It was the best 4 sentences in the document. The briefings went out on the 21st day of Cassin's 30-day window, 9 days early, 9 days before the petition's response deadline, which meant the 12 territorial lords received Kaelor's briefing before Cassin's lobbying had fully completed its work. Before the version of events that turned everything 90 degrees had been fully installed in the minds of the people whose votes determined what happened next. They did not have to wait long. The first response came within 4 days. Lord Fenroth of the Northern Territory, a man Lyra had never met, whose written reply was brief and direct and confirmed, with the flat economy of a frontier lord who did not waste language, that he had reviewed the documentation and would not be supporting the extraordinary session petition. The second response came from 2 lords simultaneously, both declining to support the petition and noting that the garrison physician's documentation was, in their reading, clear evidence of active management rather than security vulnerability. The third, fourth, and fifth came in a cluster on the 12th day, and by that evening it was apparent that Cassin did not have his 6 seats. He had 3, his own vote and 2 others. And the petition would not reach the threshold for an extraordinary session. Murray delivered the news to Lyra in the music room, where she was in the middle of a lesson with Aveline and had been trying for 20 minutes to focus on the technique and not on the thing she was waiting for. Maret handed her the count without preamble and left without ceremony, which was exactly the right way to handle it, and Lyra sat with the numbers for one moment and then set them on the music room bench and turned back to the keys. "Well?" Aveline said. "He doesn't have 6. Aveline pressed a single note. Let it ring completely out. "Good," she said, and then, with the precise focus of someone who had been waiting all lesson to get back to the passage they were working on, from the third measure. 1. Cassin came to the keep one more time. He came alone. No private men, no council members, just himself and his leather document case, arriving on a gray morning when the mountain cloud had come down low and the courtyard was dim and cold and the stones were slick with the kind of damp that preceded early snow. Lyra saw him from the east wing window when his horse came through the gate, and she watched him dismount with the deliberate composure of a man who had lost a significant engagement and was determining, in real time, how he intended to conduct himself about it. Kaelor received him in the north wing study. Not the formal receiving hall, the study, which was a smaller space that said clearly, "This is a private conversation, not a formal one." Lyra was not present for it, and she did not try to be. Some conversations needed to happen without her in them, and this was one of them. She played in the music room while it happened, not strategically this time, not out the windows into the courtyard, not aimed at any listener in particular, just for herself, the way she had played her whole life when she needed to think clearly, the piece without a name, from beginning to end, and then from the beginning again. The conversation lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Maret found Lyra in the music room with the particular expression of a woman who had been carrying a weight for a long time and had just been relieved of a portion of it. "His Majesty asks if you'll join him in the North Garden." Chubbed. The North Garden in early November was spare and clear, the stubborn mountain plants gone dry for the season, the stone bench cold. But the cloud had lifted while she'd been playing, and the peaks were out, and the light had that quality it sometimes had in the high territories in late season, golden and sideways and absolutely clean, the kind of light that showed everything exactly as it was without kindness or distortion. Kaelor was standing at the center of the garden rather than the wall this time, and when she came through the gate, he turned to face her, and his expression was the open, unguarded version, the one she'd first really seen on a north wing floor at dawn, the one she'd been learning to read ever since. "What did he say?" she asked. "He said that the petition failed and that he accepts the outcome." A pause. "He also said, and this is the part that matters, that he had reviewed the full documentation of the past 6 weeks. Not just the garrison physician's records, all of it, the review, the briefing, the territorial responses." He stopped. She waited. "He said that he had built his strategy on the assumption that the bond accounts in the historical record were wishful documentation by observers who wanted the curse to have a solution, and that the evidence of the past 6 weeks has been, his word, conclusive." Lyra absorbed this. He's changed his position. He's changed his position because the evidence required it, and Cassin is, whatever else he is, a man who follows evidence. Kaelor's voice had a quality she couldn't quite categorize. Not satisfaction exactly, not vindication. Something more complex. He also said that he spent 3 years trying to manage the succession timeline because he genuinely believed the curse would take me the same way it took my father, and that any bond I formed was time I was giving someone else to lose me. A beat. He said he was wrong about that. Not about the concern, about the conclusion. The garden was very quiet. Above the wall, the mountains were gold and white. "Is he an ally now?" Lyra asked. "Not an ally, but not an opponent." A small pause. "He asked to meet you." She looked at him. "Now?" "He's in the front receiving room," the not-quite smile at the corner of his mouth. "I told him I'd ask." She thought about the man who had sent 2 private men to go through a 17-year-old girl's books, about the quiet voice in the council chamber placing her name like a stone in still water, about the letter to 12 territorial lords that had been designed to use the truth as a weapon turned sideways. Then she thought about the man who had followed evidence where it led, even when it refuted 3 years of his own strategy. About the word conclusive and what it cost a man like that to say it. "Yes," she said. "I'll meet him." The meeting was brief and not what she expected. Casson was smaller than she'd constructed him. The voice through the stone wall had given him a stature that the actual man, in a chair in a receiving room, didn't quite match. He was older than she'd imagined, tired with the specific tiredness of someone who has been operating under sustained pressure for a long time and is, at this particular moment, not performing composure. He stood when she entered. She acknowledged it with a nod and sat across from him, and he sat back down, and they looked at each other with the frank assessment of people who have been adversaries in the same fight without ever having been in the same room. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Lord Casson." A silence. He looked at her the way he had in the receiving hall all those weeks ago, the evaluating look. But the calculation behind it had changed. "You're younger than the situation suggested," he said. "People keep saying that," she said. "I'm finding that I mind it less each time." Something moved in his expression that was almost amusement. Almost. "The briefing was well constructed," he said. "The framing, proactive rather than reactive. The disclosure as responsible governance rather than confession. That was strategically sound." A pause. "That was yours. We wrote it together. The legal language was his. The narrative architecture was yours." He said it without concession or admiration, just identification, the tone of a man who is accurate about things because accuracy is useful. "You think clearly under pressure." "I've had practice," she said. Another silence. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I want to say something that is not an apology, because what I did was consistent with what I believe the situation required, and I don't apologize for acting on my best assessment of the facts. But the facts have changed, and I want to say directly that the version of you I constructed was wrong." He paused. "The version that was either naive or strategic in bad faith. The evidence doesn't support either reading." She looked at him for a moment. "What does the evidence support?" "A woman who arrived in a difficult situation with very little and responded to it with more clarity and more genuine courage than I expected." He said it the way he said everything, flat and precise, the words carrying their meaning directly without decoration. "I underestimated you. I want you to know I'm aware of that." It was not an apology, he'd said that, but it was something rarer than an apology. The honest acknowledgement of a man who did not acknowledge things easily, delivered without the softening that would have made it easier for him, but less true. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it directly." He nodded once. Stood. She stood. They were done, and both of them knew it, and there was a kind of completion in the simplicity of that. The thing resolved the way things actually resolve, not in grand gestures, but in two people looking at each other clearly across a table and saying the true version of what needed to be said. The bonding ceremony was held on the first clear day of December. It was not a grand state occasion that would come later, the formal public ceremony that the territorial body would require, and that Lyra had already begun, with characteristic practicality, to think through the logistics of. This first ceremony was smaller. The keep's inner hall, which could hold 50 people when it needed to, and held 20 comfortably on a cold December morning. The people who mattered most in the room that had become hers, Aveline, sitting in the front row with the expression of someone working very hard not to show that they were moved, failing slightly and not minding the failure. Marette, standing at the back with the bearing of a woman who had seen 30 years of Virethorn history and was adding this to the record with the same methodical care she brought to everything. The garrison physician who had spent 6 weeks documenting deterioration and 4 weeks documenting something else entirely, and had the slightly dazed look of a scientist whose data has produced an outcome he hadn't dared predict. A handful of household staff who had watched a piano tutor from the lowland city arrive in a gray carriage and stay. And Casson, standing to the side with 2 of the Virethorn Council lords, not invited exactly, but present, which was its own statement. He watched the proceedings with the expression of a man updating his records. Kaelor stood at the front of the hall in the formal gray and silver of Virethorn's ruling house, and Lyra stood across from him in a dress that was not the silver she'd worn to the Mooncrest Ball, but the deep blue of the mountain sky on a clear day. And they looked at each other the way they looked at each other when there was no one else in the room, directly, completely, without the armor. The charter officiant read the formal words. Lyra heard them through the particular clarity of a moment she knew she was going to remember for the rest of her life. Not the words exactly, but the quality of the light in the room, the cold, clean air from the mountain outside the high windows, the sound of Aveline exhaling very carefully in the front row. When the officiant finished, Kaelor reached out and took her hands in his. "I have something to say that isn't in the formal text," he said, and the hall was very quiet. "I've been running from this for 3 years. From the possibility of it, from the risk of it, from what it would mean to give someone this much access to the part of me I've been keeping most carefully protected." He paused. "I was wrong to run, and I want to say that clearly, in this room, with the people who watched me run, so that the record is correct." His hands tightened slightly on hers. "You walked into a hedge maze, and you didn't flinch from any of it. Not from the curse, not from the council, not from the mountain or the cold or the 30 days or the 2 men in Aveline's rooms. Not from any of the 100 things I handed you that I should have been carrying alone. A beat. You are the bravest person I have ever known, and I am, improbably and completely and without any reservation, yours." The hall held the silence of 20 people who had heard something true. Then Aveline said, "Finally," in a voice that was pitched for just the front row, but carried further than intended in the acoustics of a stone room, and the solemnity broke open into something warmer and realer than solemnity. Kaelor looked sideways at his sister with the expression of a man who has been exasperated by this person his entire life and is secretly grateful for them every day. "We'll discuss your timing later." "My timing was perfect," Aveline said. Lyra laughed. The real one, the one she'd spent 2 years being careful about, the one she'd been playing at the edges of since a ballroom waltz with a hooded stranger who steadied her before she knew she was falling. It came out clear and complete and without management, the laugh of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. The marking happened at the end of the ceremony, the way it had always happened in the Virethorn bond tradition, a formal acknowledgement before witnesses that the bond was real and recognized. Old custom, older than the charter, older than the fortress walls. The kind of tradition that existed in frontier cultures where the bond between an alpha and their true mate was understood to be not a sentiment but a fact of nature, as real and documentable as weather or terrain. When it happened, the room changed. Lyra felt it, not metaphorically, not as a feeling she was projecting onto the moment because she wanted to feel something significant, something physical and specific and real, like the moment a dissonant chord resolves. Like the moment a room that has been cold for a long time suddenly has a fire in it. A warmth that moved through her from the point of contact outward and settled. And the place it settled felt less like something added and more like something that had always been missing being returned. She watched Kaelor's face. The change there was unmistakable. Not gradual, immediate, the way a fever breaks. The particular quality of strain that had lived in him since she'd met him. The constant management of the thing in his blood, the 10% attention that was always diverted to the internal fight. It was gone. Not suppressed. Gone. She could see its absence the way you can see the absence of weather after a storm. Not because something new was there, but because something that had always been there wasn't anymore. His eyes, when they found hers, were clear. The gray-green she'd first seen in a hedge maze, now with nothing behind them but the present moment, and the person in front of him. "It's gone," he said, very quietly. "Just for her." "I know," she said. She tut. "I can tell." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that still had no trained name, would never have a trained name, because it was the expression of a man who had been fighting alone for so long that the cessation of fighting felt, at first, almost incomprehensible. And then, slowly, as the body learned to believe it, felt like the only thing that had ever made sense. From the side of the room, the garrison physician was writing something in his small notebook, with the focused intensity of a man capturing data he had not believed. A week ago, he would ever be capturing. From the front row, Aveline watched her brother's face and permitted herself, briefly and privately, to look exactly as moved as she was. At the back, Moret stood with the posture of 30 years of Virethorn service and permitted nothing across her face, and did not permit the fact that her eyes were bright to be something anyone mentioned. And Cassin, standing at the side, looked at the garrison physician's notebook and then at the king's face and then at Lyra's face, and he updated his records in the way of a man who follows evidence where it leads, even when it goes somewhere he did not expect. And he stood quietly with the weight of everything he'd been wrong about and did not look for an exit from it. Later, much later, when the hall had emptied and the winter dark had come down over the mountains and the keep was doing its evening breathing, the fires low and the stone warm, Lyra sat at the piano in the music room alone. She did not play the frontier ballads. She did not play the pieces she knew from years of training. She played the piece without a name, her piece, the one she'd composed in the small hours of mountain nights, from beginning to end, slowly, without hurry, the way you play something when you're not playing it for anyone but yourself, and the room, and the air, and the truth of what it contains. When she finished, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the window at the mountain dark. She thought about a hedge maze and a waltz, about a carriage on a northern road, about piano keys and stone corridors, and a book of frontier ballads left on a bench by someone who would not admit what the gesture meant, about 9 days of careful distance and one crossing of a stone floor, about the research in a library and the council chamber and the music room window open to the courtyard, about 30 days and a briefing written over cold tea in a firelit study, about the long way around to the only place she'd ever felt completely herself. She was 23 years old. She had no title, no family land, no dowry, no letter of recommendation from anyone in the city she'd left. She had a husband with a wolf in his blood and a fortress in the mountains and a frontier kingdom that was learning, slowly and not without friction, that the woman who had arrived in a gray carriage to teach piano to the princess was something considerably more than that. She had a sister-in-law who was 17 and terrifying and was going to run something large someday. She had 30 years of Moret's institutional knowledge being directed now, in her direction rather than around her. She had a garrison physician who was writing a paper about the medical documentation of true bond resonance and asked her questions about it with the slightly overwhelmed energy of a scientist who has stumbled onto something that will define his career. She had the mountains in every season and every quality of light. She had cold mornings and clear nights and air that told you exactly where you were. She had the music. She always had the music. And somewhere in the north tower above her, in the room that had been the site of the worst nights and the most private extremity, the room where she had knelt on a stone floor and offered her hand and changed the shape of everything, the King of Virethorn was sleeping, deeply, without waking, without the sounds that had moved through the stone and sent her to the piano keys on the first night in a fortress she hadn't known she was coming home to. Complete silence. The good kind. Lyra lifted her hands to the keys one more time, softly, and played the opening phrase of the piece without a name, and the music filled the cold stone room and went out through the window into the mountain dark, and the mountains held it the way they held everything, old and patient and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought was possible, and the frontier night was vast and clear and full of stars.